The poison entered Victorian homes without a sound. It hid in the shimmer of fresh paint, in the gleam of water pipes, in the powder mothers dusted across their babies' cradles. London believed lead was purity itself, white as winter light, smooth as polished bone. But beneath that sweetness lay a toxin that crept through families like a whispered curse, stealing strength, breath, and reason, one quiet evening at a time. Before we peel back the wallpaper and expose the danger Victorians refused to see, tap subscribe and stay close. And tell me softly, where are you watching from tonight? Your presence helps keep this channel alive in the fog, because once you hear how this invisible metal seeped into every parlour and every bloodstream, you'll understand why lead became the most devastating household killer of the Victorian age. It began with a brightness so gentle, so pure, that few questioned it. In the dimness of early Victorian mornings, when fog pressed against the window panes like a restless spirit, the newly painted walls of London homes glowed with an impossible whiteness. That whiteness, smooth as porcelain, soft as cloud, was the mark of refinement. Families were proud of it, builders recommended it, painters praised it, and shops displayed tin upon tin of the miraculous pigment that made it possible: white lead. When brushed onto plaster, it seemed to calm the room. A parlour looked larger, a hallway cleaner, a nursery almost heavenly. Mothers admired the way it caught the candlelight, turning humble cottages into chambers of pale elegance. They could not know that each stroke of the brush was a warning, one that whispered not with sound but with dust. The toxin hid behind beauty, the way a ghost hides behind its own silence. The painters themselves knew something was amiss. They coughed through their work, chalk dust collecting in the creases of their sleeves, their breath turning faint and sweet. Yet the foreman would wave it away. Only the smell of fresh paint, he said, a sign of quality. And so the men laboured on, stirring the thick white mixture with wooden paddles, unaware that the very brightness they created was slowly dimming the light behind their own eyes. When the last coat dried, the family returned to admire the transformation. The father noted that the room looked modern, the mother that it felt cleaner. The children traced tiny fingers along the wainscoting, leaving faint trails where flakes of paint loosened under their touch. No one saw the powder that drifted down in thin, invisible snow. No one heard the house exhale a breath of dust as the door closed behind them. By nightfall, the air had warmed just enough for tiny particles to lift from the walls. They floated lazily, mingling with the smoke of the hearth, settling into the folds of curtains, into the weave of carpets, into the lungs of those who slept nearby. The youngest child, restless in his cradle, whimpered in his sleep. His mother placed a hand on his chest, feeling the faint flutter of breath, never imagining that each rise and fall carried with it a sweetness that did not belong. Doctors of the day called such symptoms nervous disorders, or perhaps teething fever, if a child was involved. They had books full of elegant names: colic, ague, melancholy, anything but the truth. After all, how could something so beautiful be harmful? How could a pigment praised in every shop window be the source of trembling hands, aching joints, and minds slipping into fog? Outside, the city hummed on. Horses clattered along cobblestones dusted with the same bright powder that now lined the family's lungs. Chimneys exhaled smoke and soot, mingling with the metallic scent that rose from newly painted homes. London glittered faintly in the lamplight, its whiteness a badge of progress. No one noticed how the shine crept into shadows. For now, the walls remained quiet. The danger did not need to hurry. It had already settled into the cracks of the house, into the softness of the pillows, into the beating hearts of those who lived within. The paint had done its work, and it waited calm, perfect, poisonous for the days to come. The nursery was the gentlest room in the house. Sunlight, when it bothered to visit, slipped through lace curtains in pale ribbons, landing softly upon the cradle and the toys arranged with tender precision. Everything within those four walls seemed touched by a hush, the quiet of early mornings, the stillness before a child's breath breaks into laughter or tears. It was here that the white paint shone brightest, here that the toxin hid most patiently. For the Victorians, a nursery was meant to soothe. Mothers believed soft colours calmed the spirit, and nothing appeared softer than a wash of white lead across the plaster. The walls glowed with a powdery sweetness, the kind that made visitors smile and remark upon the room's purity, its heavenly light. No one noticed the fine dust gathering along the baseboards, or the faint powder loosening around the window frame with every shift of the wind. The danger did not shout, it merely waited. Upon the floor, a child sat among wooden blocks and cloth dolls, his round cheeks flushed with the warmth of the late afternoon. He tapped his toys against the wainscoting, releasing tiny flakes of paint that drifted onto his hands. Now and then, he rubbed his eyes, and the dust slipped in unnoticed, as quiet as a whispered lullaby. The sweetness of lead had a way of travelling, from fingertip to lip, from cradle to breath. His mother watched from the doorway, proud of the room she had prepared before his birth. She remembered the painter calling the pigment angel white, a shade that would brighten the child's temperament. How eagerly she had agreed. How eagerly she now opened windows each morning, thinking the crisp air would carry away whatever made his forehead so warm, his limbs so heavy. She blamed teething, blamed the season, blamed his restless nights. Never the walls that glowed benignly back at her. At times, she would catch him chewing gently on a chipped wooden rail of the cradle, just a curious child tasting his world. She wiped his mouth clean with her handkerchief, not noticing the faint grey smear that remained on the linen. The maid swept the floor each morning, coughing softly as she disturbed the powder that had settled overnight. She, too, dismissed her symptoms. Everyone did. When the child first grew listless, no one thought of poison. He slept longer, whimpered more. His small fingers curled with strange stubbornness, resisting even the warmest baths. The doctor arrived smelling of camphor and starch, pressing his cool palm to the child's cheek. "A common infant malady," he murmured. "A touch of nerves." He prescribed tonics that clouded the mother's hope with their bitterness. Yet the illness lingered like a spectre in the corners of the nursery. Outside, carriages rattled past, their wheels scattering white dust from the city's painted facades. London breathed toxins in a slow rhythm, unaware of how deeply they had become part of its domestic heartbeat. Inside the nursery, the air thickened subtly, carrying with it a sweetness that did not belong to any flower or perfume. It clung to the cradle rails, the blankets, the soft curls at the child's temple. The mother rocked him gently, humming an old lullaby her own mother once sang. The room glowed around her, serene and deceptive. She told herself he would be better by morning, that no nursery this lovely could harbour harm. Yet each night, as the lamps dimmed, a fine dust settled again over the toys, the cradle, the sleeping breath of the child, and in the hush of the quietest room in the house, the invisible toxin continued its work silent, patient, and utterly unopposed. The trouble often began with a sweetness, an innocent, pleasant taste upon the tongue that made the morning tea seem strangely smooth. Few questioned it. In Victorian London, where water was drawn from rivers thick with refuse and pipes rattled with age, a hint of sweetness felt almost like improvement. Housewives welcomed it, lodgers ignored it. Servants, who boiled the kettles long before dawn, merely shrugged when it appeared. They could not see the tarnish spreading inside the pipes, nor the poison that seeped into every cup. Lead pipes were prized for their obedience. They bent easily, promised longevity, and whispered of modernity. Builders boasted of them as a sign of progress, threading them through walls and beneath floors with quiet confidence. In the dim underbelly of London homes, The pipes curved like pale metal serpents, smooth, silent, and utterly treacherous. Each carried water that wore them down, grain by grain, leaching lead into the household without a single protest from iron or copper. In one modest townhouse off Bloomsbury, the morning ritual unfolded with gentle predictability. The cook lit the stove, pumping water into the heavy kettle. She did not see the slight clouding at the bottom, nor the faint metallic scent rising with the steam. She assumed the bitterness of life caused her headaches, not the water she swallowed in hurried sips between tasks. Her mistress, meanwhile, sat in the parlour, awaiting her tea. She prided herself on her delicate palate, often remarking how London water has a peculiar charm. She enjoyed that faint sweetness. She never imagined it was the first sign of danger, slipping into her bloodstream with every swallow. The maid poured the tea, the liquid glowing amber in the china cup, innocent as a lullaby. Upstairs, a young man prepared for work, splashing water onto his face from the porcelain basin. The droplets rolled down his cheeks, entering small cuts from his razor. He shivered not from cold, but from a subtle weakness that had crept into his bones these past weeks. He blamed the weather, the fog, the pace of city life, never the pipework humming behind the plaster. As winter deepened, the pipes groaned under the strain. Frost tightened them. Thawing loosened their joints. Tiny flakes peeled off from within, carried faithfully into every kettle and basin. No one saw the tarnish gathering in the water cistern or the faint grey ring appearing around the washing bowls. When the children complained of stomach pains, when their mother felt faint after climbing the stairs, the household blamed exhaustion, household damp, or delicate constitutions. The doctor, summoned reluctantly, brought with him a small leather bag and a large collection of guesses. He prescribed rest, tinctures, cordials, and the occasional mustard poultice. He never inspected the pipes. He never asked about the water. The thought that something so essential, so ordinary, could be corrupted seemed absurd. Outside, the city roared with carriages and factory whistles, unaware that thousands of households drew their ailments from the very water meant to sustain them. Lead travelled quietly, without odour or colour. Only the faint sweetness betrayed it, and even that was mistaken for improvement. One evening, as the family gathered for supper, the cook filled glasses from the carafe on the sideboard. The mother's hand trembled slightly as she lifted hers. She steadied it with the other, forcing a smile. The water glimmered in the candlelight, clear and inviting, reflecting the soft glow of the painted walls. No one sensed the poison swirling within. Down in the cellar, a drop of water slid down the curve of a pipe, carrying with it another invisible grain of metal. The tarnish crept onward, steady and unhurried. The house rested above it, unaware of how deeply the toxin had already seeped into its daily rhythms, its bodies, its breath. And the water, faithful, essential, deceptive, continued its quiet work. Her day began before the sun, long before the first carriage clattered down the street or the lamplighters finished their rounds. In the faint grey of early morning, the housemaid moved through the townhouse like a quiet shadow, opening shutters, sweeping hearths, dusting mantles. Her hands were small, precise, and obedient. But in recent months they had taken on a troubling pallor, a ghostly whiteness that no amount of scrubbing could remove. At first, she thought it was simply the cold. Winter had settled over London with its usual damp chill, seeping into bones and fingertips alike. But as she polished the painted window frames each morning, she noticed how the dust clung to her skin like frost. It left a faint, chalky sheen upon her fingers, gathering beneath her nails and settling into the small creases of her knuckles. She wiped them clean on her apron, unaware that the apron too was becoming a carrier of poison. Her mistress praised her diligence. "Such spotless windows," she would say, admiring the soft gleam of the painted sills. "The room feels brighter already." The housemaid bowed her head, grateful. though her temples throbbed with a familiar ache. She tried to ignore the weakness creeping into her wrists, the strange heaviness that made the broom feel as though it were carved from stone rather than wood. Each task brought her into closer contact with the toxin she could not see. Every morning she shook the dustcloth beside the open window, releasing a slow, shimmering cloud that drifted into her breath. Every afternoon, she scrubbed the white-painted stair rail with a damp rag, loosening flakes that stuck to her damp skin. Every night, she beat rugs in the courtyard, sending up plumes of fine powder that settled upon her hair and lashes like a pale snowfall. She grew thinner, her appetite faltered, her complexion lost its warmth. Fellow servants whispered that she worked too hard, or ate too little, or simply lacked the sturdy constitution needed for city life. The housemaid herself believed she was failing in duty, never suspecting that the house she tended was quietly undoing her from within. One morning, while scrubbing the parlour's painted baseboards, she felt a sudden tingling in her fingers, as though a swarm of pins had pricked her skin. She shook her hands to dispel the sensation, but the numbness lingered, climbing slowly up her forearms. She paused, breath shallow, waiting for the feeling to pass. It did not. She hid her condition as best she could. Servants were easily replaced, and illness carried the risk of dismissal. When her fingertips turned slightly blue-tinged, she wore gloves. When her limbs trembled, she steadied herself against the walls she was tasked to polish. And when her cough deepened, she blamed the damp cellar where she fetched coal each morning. Her employer noticed only her growing clumsiness, the dropped teacup, the uneven polishing, the faint smudges left on door frames. "Mind yourself," her mistress chided. "A maid must keep steady hands." The girl apologized, bowing low, hoping the tremor in her knees was not visible beneath her skirts. But the poison had already made its home in her blood. Her hands, once nimble and sure, had become pale, trembling things. Her breath grew short, her nights restless. In quiet moments, she pressed her fingertips against her temples, willing the throbbing behind her eyes to cease. Still, each dawn she rose and resumed her duties. The painted walls glowed softly around her, their deceptive whiteness hiding the truth she could not name. She dusted, polished, scrubbed each motion, a gesture of devotion to a home that did not return her loyalty. And as the lead settled deeper into her bones, the house hummed contentedly. Its beauty remained intact, its poison remained invisible, and the housemaid, faithful and fading, moved through its rooms like a fragile spectre, pale hands glimmering softly in the morning light. He arrived with the quiet importance expected of a Victorian physician. Black coat brushed clean, boots polished to a faint glow, leather bag creaking softly at his side. In the homes he visited, illness was considered a visitor unwelcome, but familiar, and the doctor was the gentleman entrusted to usher it back out the door. Yet, despite his dignity and experience, he stood before ailments he could not decipher, symptoms that refused to fit neatly into the categories his textbooks had so confidently described. It began with a summons from a respectable household in Bloomsbury. The mistress reported fainting spells, headaches, and an unshakable fatigue. Her children suffered stomach cramps. The youngest had begun to stagger while walking. The maid, pale as linen, had collapsed days earlier while sweeping the stairs. But when the physician entered the parlour, he saw only a genteel family weakened, he believed, by the season or the strain of household duties. He inspected the patients with practiced precision, pulse taken, tongue examined, eyelids lifted. He murmured reassuring platitudes. A touch of nervous exhaustion, seasonal malaise, infantile indigestion. His diagnoses were delivered with the confidence of a man who understood the world through the narrow lens of his training. And nothing in that training had prepared him for the possibility that the sickness filling this house seeped not from draughts or dampness, but from the very walls around them. He did not notice the fine dust that danced like pale smoke, when he brushed past the wainscoting. He did not question the faint metallic sweetness in the air, a scent so delicate that the family no longer registered it at all. The physician, accustomed to the odors of illness, camphor, vinegar, carbolic, simply ignored the delicate shimmer of particulate matter that settled on his coat as he unpacked his instruments. When he questioned the mother, she flushed with embarrassment. "I have been fatigued," she admitted. "But surely it is nothing serious." She blamed her sleepless nights, her duties, the weather. She never mentioned the strange taste lingering in the water pitcher. She never thought to connect her ailments to the creamy whiteness of the walls, which she had so proudly selected only months before. The youngest child whimpered from the nursery. The physician examined him next, lifting the small boy into his arms. The child's limbs felt oddly stiff, his head lolled in a way that suggested nervous affliction. The doctor sighed sympathetically. "Teething troubles," he concluded, though the child's gums were swollen not from teeth, but from toxins accumulating within fragile bones. When the maid entered with tea, her hands trembled so violently that the china rattled on the tray. The doctor noticed the shaking but attributed it to nerves. Servants, in his view, were prone to such frights. He had no notion that her body was drowning in poison, her fingertips tinged with the faint blue that marked the slow, relentless advance of lead. He prescribed rest, tonics thick with syrup and laudanum, and soothing poultices. He recommended fresh air, gentle exercise, and a temporary reduction in household duties. He reassured the family that the symptoms would pass in due time. And yet, as he left the home, stepping into the pale London fog, the sickness remained, coiled within the very structure of the house. The walls gleamed after his departure, serene and deadly. The water continued its silent contamination. The dust settled again on mantelpieces and pillows, waiting for the next breath, the next touch, the next unwitting victim. The physician walked on, unaware that he had not cured an illness, but misdiagnosed a warning once spoken not by fever or infection, but by the quiet, persistent whisper of an invisible toxin woven into the daily lives of those he had sworn to protect. And the danger, unrecognized, continued its patient work. It hung in the showroom like a dream made tangible rows of wallpaper, unfurled in rich waves of color, each more enchanting than the last. Victorian London adored ornament, and no room felt complete without a pattern that whispered of elegance, refinement, or fashionable whimsy. The most coveted designs bore delicate florals, curling vines, gilded trims, and tiny shimmering particles that caught the light like frost on a winter window. Customers ran their fingers over the samples, marveling at their beauty, unaware that one of the era's loveliest luxuries concealed a quietly lethal secret. Among these coveted papers was a particular pattern, painted in soft greens and whites, that mimicked the tranquility of a garden at dawn. Its gentle hues soothed the eye, its pale background brightened even the dimmest chambers. And though shoppers admired it for its artistry, its cost, its respectable provenance, none ever questioned its contents. The pigment that granted the paper its delicate luster, the faint shimmer, the powdery sheen was lead. A young couple, newly settled in a modest London townhouse, selected this pattern for their sitting room. They imagined evenings spent by the hearth, light bouncing off the beautiful walls, guests remarking on the tasteful decor. The wallpaper hanger arrived with a paste bucket and a cheerful disposition, soaked the sheets in adhesive, and pressed each panel into place. With every sweep of his brush, with every tap of his smoothing cloth, tiny motes of pigment rose into the air, swirling unnoticed in the late afternoon light. When he finished, the room felt transformed. The couple admired it with pride, marveling at how the space now glowed. The air itself seemed lighter. They did not see the faint dust left on the floorboards or the small flecks clinging to the curtain hems. They did not feel the slow settling of particles onto the cushions, the mantel, the carpets. The beauty of the room overwhelmed any sense of caution. Over time, the wallpaper aged, as all things do. In the warm months, humidity loosened the adhesive. In winter, the chill cracked the paper. Each shift released more dust so fine, so pale, that it disappeared into the air like exhaled breath. The couple swept often, believing their attentiveness kept the home in pristine condition. Yet the dust returned each day, lighter than ash, slipping between the fibers of upholstery, coating the dining table before breakfast. Guests complimented the pattern, often leaning close to inspect its artistry. Some found themselves coughing afterward, blaming the coal smoke drifting from neighboring chimneys. Others left with headaches they attributed to the bustle of the city. The culprit remained silent, shimmering softly from the walls that surrounded them. One afternoon, the wife noticed faint discoloration near the baseboard, a patch where the wallpaper had begun to crumble. She brushed at it gently, releasing a tiny cloud that glittered in the sunbeam slicing through the window. She watched it drift for a moment, beautiful as dust motes in a cathedral. Then it vanished. Within days, she developed an ache behind her eyes, a persistent one that resisted herbal teas and rest. Her husband's appetite diminished. He claimed work was wearing him thin. Their toddler, who spent long hours crawling beside the walls, grew irritable and pale. Still, the wallpaper remained the pride of their home. The doctor blamed nerves, overwork, and the dampness of the winter. He admired the room himself, praising the couple's taste. Never once did he consider that the delicate pattern, the one too beautiful to resist, was leaching poison into the very air they breathed. And the wallpaper, luminous and silent, continued its patient drift of dust. Each particle a whisper, each shimmer a warning, each breath another step deeper into an unseen danger, woven into the very fabric of Victorian domestic life. The smell crept through the house long after the family had gone to bed. It drifted beneath doors and along staircases, a faint sweetness mingling with the coal smoke settling into the night. Fresh paint was supposed to be reassuring, a sign of renewal, improvement, progress. Victorian Homes wore it like a badge of respectability. Yet the scent that lingered at midnight felt strangely alive, as though the walls themselves exhaled in the darkness. Earlier that day, the painters had left with cheerful nods, their boots streaked with pale dust. They promised the room would be perfect by morning, the paint dry as bone. They did not mention how the lead within the mixture, warmed by firelight and sealed air, would continue to vaporize into the household's breath long after their departure. They did not speak of the invisible threads of poison unfurling in the stillness of night. In the parlor, the new coat gleamed softly, even with the lamps extinguished. Moonlight slid across it like a thin silver blade, revealing the faint shimmer of freshly brushed pigment. The room smelled of purity, too much purity, a sweetness that was almost floral, almost medicinal, and entirely deceptive. The family upstairs slept unaware that each inhalation carried with it a trace of something dangerous, metallic, and patient. Near midnight, the master of the house stirred. A dull headache pressed behind his temples, as though the night itself had weight. He rose, descended the staircase, and stepped into the freshly painted parlor. The moment he crossed the threshold, the scent enveloped him. Thick, sweet, clinging. He rubbed his eyes, feeling a strange heaviness in his limbs. "What an odor," he muttered, imagining it was merely the inconvenience of drying paint. He cracked the window, allowing a narrow wedge of cold fog to spill inside. The air outside was harsh but honest coal smoke, horse dung, river damp. None of it felt as suffocating as the sweetness behind him. He did not know that lead paint, when fresh, released a fine mist of particles invisible even in the most generous gaslight. He could not see the dust gathering in the folds of the drapery, nor the tiny flakes settling on the mantelpiece, nor the residue clinging to the brass handle of the window he touched. Upstairs, his wife turned in her sleep, her dreams muddled and thick. She had felt faint all evening, blaming the commotion of the painters. Their daughter whimpered softly in her cot, kicking her legs in restless spurts. Her small lungs drew in the night air saturated with the remnants of today's renovations. In the servants' quarters, the housemaid awoke coughing. She pressed a cloth to her mouth, shaking as the headache she had carried for weeks pulsed again behind her eyes. She suspected the newly painted walls she always had, but no one believed a servant's intuition, especially when it contradicted the optimism of progress. By dawn, the scent had thinned, but the effects remained. The family awoke sluggish, their throats dry, their temples pounding in dull unison. At breakfast, the father complained of dizziness. The mother forced a smile despite the tremor in her hands. The child refused food, her stomach knotted with an inexplicable sickness. Yet when they entered the parlor, they admired the fresh paint anew. "How bright it looks," the mother whispered, ignoring the metallic taste lingering on her tongue. What they saw was beauty. What they breathed was harm. And still, the parlor exhaled softly, sweetly, its invisible toxin working quietly in the hush before the next midnight came. It appeared first as a curiosity, an odd, faint dryness on the tongue, a chalkiness that settled at the back of the throat. In a Victorian household accustomed to soot on windows and grit in gutters, such sensations rarely inspired alarm. But this taste did not belong to the street or the river or the city's constant breath of smoke. It came from within the home, settling quietly onto everything the family touched, ate, and inhaled. The morning bread was always sliced fresh from the loaf, warm from the kitchen hearth. Yet lately, when the family lifted their first bite of the day, they paused. Something in the flavor felt altered, subtle, powdery, as though a thin film of dust had gathered upon the crust while no one watched. The mother frowned and brushed the slice with her fingertips, believing the baker had been careless. She did not realize the dust had not come from the bakery at all, but from the gentle drift of lead particles descending nightly from the painted sills and ceiling beams above. In the dining room, the walls gleamed with a fresh coat of white lead paint, applied only a season ago. Each time the room warmed with sunlight or firelight, the surface loosened its grip on tiny, pale flecks, too fine to notice individually, but too persistent to avoid. They settled on the tablecloth, on the silverware, and especially on the bread left cooling on the sideboard. The children were the first to complain. "It tastes strange," the eldest murmured, wiping her tongue with her sleeve. Her younger brother, less articulate, simply spat his piece into his napkin with a grimace. Their mother scolded them gently for their fussiness, insisting they eat before the bread cooled. But even she felt the odd dryness clinging to her mouth like ash. To mask her unease, she sprinkled sugar on the slices, hoping sweetness might overpower the unfamiliar grit. It did not. The chalky film remained, persistent as the headache swelling behind her eyes. The cook, who prepared the meal before dawn, had noticed the dust long before the family tasted it. When she set the rising dough near the window, a faint powder always collected on the surface. She tried covering it with cloth, but the dust found its way through the weave. It was everywhere, on shelves, on plates, even in the water she used to wash the vegetables. She sighed, blaming the city's endless pollution, never suspecting that the danger came not from without, but from the very walls enclosing her. At breakfast, the father chewed slowly, swallowing with difficulty. He assumed the bread was stale, or that his own tongue had grown overly sensitive. His thoughts were dulled these days. His limbs felt heavy. He attributed it to overwork, never imagining that the chalkiness on the bread was a symptom, not a flaw. As the meal ended, the maid cleared the table, gathering crumbs dusted with a sheen barely visible in the slanted morning light. She brushed them into her apron, releasing another faint cloud as she moved. It danced briefly around her hands before settling on the floor, where it waited to cling to shoes, skirts, and the next day's meal. Outside, the city bustled. Chimney sweeps trudged through alleys, market stalls filled the air with shouts and steam. Life continued with its usual noise and grime. But inside the house, a quieter threat persisted, silent, pale, and patient. The chalky taste on the morning bread was only the first hint of lead's encroachment, a subtle warning carried on the simplest rituals of daily life. And each bite, the family's first act of nourishment, became another step deeper into the toxin's slow, relentless embrace. She had always carried her daughter with effortless grace, lifting her from the cradle, balancing her on one hip while tending the fire, swinging her gently in the garden when the fog allowed them a moment of sunlight. But in recent weeks, her arms had grown strangely heavy. It began as a dull ache, nothing more than the fatigue any Victorian mother might feel after long hours of household duty. Yet soon, the ache deepened into something sharper, something that lingered even after rest. And one winter morning, as she bent to lift her child from the nursery floor, her hands trembled. The girl weighed no more than she had the week before, but to her mother's weak and wavering limbs, she felt impossibly heavy. The mother blamed herself. She had always prided herself on sturdiness, on the quiet strength needed to maintain a home, soothe a husband, care for a growing child. Illness was something she allowed only in whispers, not in her own bones. She hid the trembling as best she could, gripping furniture when she felt dizzy, leaning subtly against doorways when her legs weakened beneath her. No one must suspect, she told herself. She simply needed sleep, perhaps warmer stockings, perhaps more iron in her diet. But iron was not her deficiency. Something far more insidious was hollowing her. The nursery, still glowing with its soft white paint, seemed brighter than ever, almost mocking in its purity. She sat on the edge of the child's little bed, willing her arms to steady. Her daughter reached up, wanting to be held, and the mother forced a smile. She gathered the girl into her lap, though her hands tingled with numbness, and her shoulders felt as though pins had been pressed beneath the skin. As she rocked the child, her gaze drifted toward the windowsill. Tiny flakes of paint had settled there, so delicate they resembled crushed pearl. She brushed them away with a cloth, only to see more loosened by her touch. She thought nothing of it. Houses aged, paint cracked, dust accumulated. It was simply part of life. The physician had visited days before. He observed her pallor, the darkening shadows beneath her eyes, the shaking of her fingers as she poured tea. But his conclusion was familiar: nervous exhaustion, brought on by womanly strain. He prescribed rest, fresh air, and a tonic bitter enough to startle her senses. He did not ask about the paint. He did not ask about the plumbing. He did not ask why her child also seemed weaker, quieter, more listless than usual. Lead had made a home in their blood, but the doctor had not the language to name it. One afternoon, while carrying the girl down the staircase, the mother faltered. Her knee buckled, and she clutched the banister, heart racing as she steadied herself. Her daughter clung to her neck, frightened by the sudden jolt. The mother whispered soothing words, but the fear lingered long after she set the child safely on her feet. Later that evening, when she attempted to knead dough for supper, her fingers refused to obey. They cramped, curled inward, as though resisting the labor they had performed daily for years. She cried out softly, more in frustration than pain, and the maid rushed in, startled. Seeing her mistress bent over the kitchen table, trembling, the maid hesitated before offering help. She, too, knew weakness in her limbs. She, too, felt the ache that would not leave. But servants did not speak freely of such things. That night, after the household slept, the mother sat alone in the dim parlor, her hands resting uselessly in her lap. The freshly painted walls around her shimmered faintly in the lamplight, their brightness undimmed by the hours of darkness. A strange metallic taste lingered at the back of her throat. She inhaled deeply, unaware that the air she sought for comfort carried with it the very particles unmaking her strength. In the quiet stillness, she lifted her hands and watched them tremble in the air. She could not lift her child anymore, not without pain, not without fear, not without feeling as though her own body had betrayed her. And still, the house glowed softly, beautifully, deceptively, its whiteness hiding the poison that had woven itself into her muscles, her bones, her breath. The mother wiped a tear from her cheek, unaware that the dust settling invisibly around her was already preparing tomorrow's symptoms. The toxin did its work gently, insistently, silently, just as it had in countless Victorian homes where beauty masked a cold, patient danger waiting in the walls. London prided itself on its brightness. In an age where coal smoke clung to every window pane and winter fog swallowed the lamplight whole, any hint of radiance felt like triumph. And so the city embraced white paint with a fervor bordering on devotion. Parlours gleamed beneath gaslight, shop fronts shone with theatrical brilliance, and tenements, despite their decay, wore coats of lead white as though they wished to mimic the respectability of the wealthy. The glow became a signature of Victorian domestic pride, a promise that beauty could be painted over hardship. But beauty, in this case, was a thin and dangerous veil. Strolling through the streets at dusk, one could see rows of houses glowing faintly beneath the haze, each facade reflecting the lamplight with a softness that felt almost hopeful. Families gathered outside, admiring the fresh coats applied for holidays or new tenants. Even the poorest neighborhoods fought to maintain a semblance of cleanliness, scrubbing soot from the walls, only to reveal the pale sheen of lead paint beneath. Londoners spoke of the glow as though it were a blessing. They did not see the dust drifting from window sills or the flakes gathering in gutters after each rain. They knew only that white meant refinement, purity, and progress, a modern touch in a city grappling with filth and fear. Inside the drawing rooms of the respectable classes, guests often marveled at the interiors as much as the company. "How luminous," they would remark, fingertips grazing the smooth painted walls. Hostesses glowed with pride, accepting the compliment as though it reflected their own virtue. None noticed when their gloves bore a faint, chalky residue after the touch. None questioned why the air felt dry, or why their tongues tingled faintly after an evening near the hearth. In theatres, galleries, and government buildings, the same white gleam prevailed. Architects chose lead-rich pigments for their durability and brilliance. Decorators praised the way they caught candlelight. Merchants assured buyers that nothing rivaled the purity of white lead. It was the fashion of the age, one that asked no questions and offered no warnings. Behind closed doors, however, the signs of danger multiplied. A clerk fainted at his post, claiming exhaustion. A seamstress complained of trembling fingers, ruining her stitches. Children in schoolrooms grew pale and lethargic. Mothers whispered of headaches that lingered for weeks, of limbs that weakened for no reason at all. These were private miseries, endured in silence, attributed to nerves, climate, or constitution. No one thought to link the suffering to the bright walls surrounding them. Even the shopkeepers who sold the paint suffered symptoms without recognizing their cause. Their workshops were powdered with fine white dust, the floors coated with flakes from open barrels. They swept constantly, yet the air always tasted faintly metallic, always carried that deceptive sweetness. Workers went home with their hair, clothes, and lungs full of poison, believing only that the job was hard but respectable, and the city, proud, bustling, relentless, saw nothing amiss. London's glow at night was admired from bridges and carriages alike. Writers immortalized its charm, artists painted its luminosity. But beneath the aesthetic praise lurked an invisible hazard, settling into every breath. The brightness London adored was the same brightness eroding its people from within. By the time the danger began to reveal itself in fractures of health and waves of unexplained illness, The city was already deeply invested in the lie. The glow had become part of its identity, and no one, neither physicians nor lawmakers, neither merchants nor mothers, imagined that the charm they praised was crafted from a toxin, working quietly in every room touched by its deceptive whiteness. London admired the glow, and the glow, patient and poisonous, admired London back, knowing it would not be questioned for many years to come. The parlour was meant to be the pride of the home, the room reserved for guests, for Sunday conversations, for quiet evenings spent beneath the soft flicker of gaslight. In many Victorian households, it was the most carefully tended space, polished daily, dusted faithfully, decorated with equal parts sentiment and ambition. This particular parlour glowed with a whiteness its owners admired deeply. The walls brushed in thick lead paint, the mouldings gleaming like carved ivory. Beauty enveloped the room. Elegance framed every chair and mantelpiece. No one suspected that the loveliness itself carried a quiet, suffocating threat. It began subtly. A guest visiting for afternoon tea would pause mid-sentence, hand drifting to the throat, as if the air had grown unexpectedly heavy. A lingering cough might echo through the room, politely muffled behind a handkerchief, decorated with embroidered violets. "How stifling the city air is today," someone would remark, blaming the fog, the season, the chimney smoke. They never blamed the parlour. Yet the parlour was the true culprit. The lead paint on the walls reacted eagerly to warmth. Whenever the fire crackled in the hearth or the gas lamps hissed gently above, the surface loosened its grip on microscopic flakes. They rose invisibly into the air, silent, delicate, patient, and drifted with every footstep, every soft stirring of conversation. The room's beauty turned traitorous, stealing breath even as it invited admiration. The mistress of the house sensed the heaviness before anyone else. She felt it while arranging flowers on the mantel, while smoothing the lace doilies her mother had passed down. By the time guests arrived, her throat would already be tight, her breath shallow. She attributed it to nerves. A hostess must always appear composed, and so she smiled through the discomfort, offering tea with hands she prayed would not tremble. The fire only worsened matters. As heat rose, so too did the dust, unseen, unspoken, yet inescapably present. Guests flushed beneath their collars, fanned themselves discreetly, reached for water. The air felt thick, as though someone had drawn a velvet curtain across the lungs. A child visiting one afternoon fell asleep on the parlour settee, her small breaths erratic and uneven. Her mother scooped her up, whispering that the city was too much for a delicate constitution. No one suspected the room. Not when the footman who polished the mouldings found himself wheezing before dusk. Not when the father of the household felt a strange pressure in his chest while reading the newspaper by the fire. Not when the maid found dusty grey smears on her damp cloth each morning after wiping the wainscoting. The parlour remained exquisite, a testament to taste, refinement, and Victorian warmth. Its charm concealed its cruelty with perfect grace. One evening, after hosting a small gathering, the mistress lingered alone in the dimming lamplight. Her head throbbed. Her breath came shallow. She lowered herself into her favourite chair, wondering why fatigue clung to her so fiercely these days. Her gaze drifted across the room, admiring the gleam of the paint, the radiance of the mouldings, the serenity of the pale walls. A soft haze hovered in the air, barely visible, illuminated by the dying glow of the fire. She believed it to be smoke, only smoke. With a tired sigh, she leaned back, unaware that each breath she drew pulled more of the haze into her lungs. The parlour had become a perfect trap, beautiful enough to invite admiration, toxic enough to quietly steal the breath of all who entered. And as the last ember in the hearth flickered out, the room settled into its usual calm, its brightness hiding once more the danger drifting gently through its elegant, suffocating air. The gas lamps were the heart of the evening. With a soft hiss and a trembling glow, they banished the darkness that pooled in corners and clung to stairwells. Victorians regarded them as marvels small, domestic suns suspended in glass. They illuminated parlours, dining rooms, nurseries, and passages with a warm amber light that promised safety and civility after the fall of night. But beneath that comfort lived a danger, as quiet as it was cunning, for each lamp, with its steady heat, awakened something toxic in the painted walls around it. The first sign was a shimmer. When the lamp nearest the mantel was lit, the brightness revealed tiny specks swirling lazily in the air, like dust stirred by an unseen hand. To most, it was nothing more than the harmless dance of everyday particles. But these specks were not dust. They were fragments, lead-laden flakes gently torn from the walls by the lamp's heat, rising with a delicate insistence toward those who breathed in the room. The mistress of the house lit the lamps each evening precisely at 6. She struck the match, shielded the flame from draughts, and lifted the glass chimney with practiced care. As the lamp flared to life, the air warmed instantly. She smiled, admiring the golden glow spreading across the freshly painted hallway. It made the home feel inviting, modern, alive. She did not notice the faint metallic scent that followed. Gas lamps heated more than the room. They warmed the walls, the mouldings, the window frames coated in thick layers of white lead. As the temperature rose, the paint softened imperceptibly. Its surface loosened, its edges curled like old parchment. Minute fragments drifted free, too faint to see yet potent enough to fill the home with invisible hazard. By supper, the family often complained of mild headaches. "Too long a day," the father would say as he rubbed his temples. The children grew irritable. The maid felt breathless each time she entered the room to clear dishes or stoke the fire. Yet no one drew the connection between their symptoms and the warmth radiating so invitingly from the lamps above. One evening, the youngest child pointed toward the glow, fascinated by the halo it cast upon the wall. "It sparkles," she whispered, her small voice filled with wonder. Her mother followed her gaze, noticing for the first time the faint glimmer hovering in the lamplight. She stepped closer, brushing her fingers along the painted surface. The tips came away with a pale residue she mistook for common dust. With a soft laugh, she wiped her hands on her apron, thinking nothing more of it. But the maid, watching from the doorway, felt a chill. She had seen that same dust cling to her own skin each morning, felt it settle in her throat with every breath she drew near the lamps. She had tried to mention it once. Her mistress dismissed the worry before the words fully left her mouth. "It is only household dust," she said. "We must simply clean more thoroughly." Yet the cleaning stirred up more poison than it removed. As the weeks passed, the symptoms grew harder to ignore. The father often retired early, too dizzy to remain at the supper table. The mother's hands began to tremble faintly as she embroidered beneath the lamplight. The children developed a persistent cough that worsened as night fell. The maid's chest felt tight, her breath shallow, her limbs weaker by the day. Still, each night the lamps were lit. The gaslight offered beauty, warmth, reassurance, a golden promise against the dark. But as it burned, it summoned danger from the walls themselves, coaxing forth the invisible toxin that drifted through the air like a pale, deadly mist. And so, with every hiss of ignition, every soft bloom of light, the lamps did more than brighten the room. They awakened the poison sleeping quietly within it, stirring the dust that stole each breath with exquisite, lethal patience. The kitchen was the engine of the Victorian home, warm, bustling, alive with the clatter of utensils and the steady hum of daily chores. Here the coal stove breathed its smoky sighs. Here dough rose beneath damp cloths. Here kettles hissed with the promise of morning tea. Yet beneath all its familiar sounds and scents lay a sweetness that did not belong. A sweetness not of sugar, nor fruit, nor spice, but of something metallic, faint, and deeply wrong. The trouble began with the water. Drawn from pipes that wound through the house like pale, serpentine veins, the water arrived each morning clouded with a subtle gleam. The cook noticed at first a peculiar brightness beneath the surface, as though light clung to it in a way that resisted any amount of boiling. When she raised a ladleful to her lips to test the temperature, she paused. A strange taste lingered on her tongue. Not unpleasant, not alarming, simply sweet, an echo of something she could not name. She dismissed it as a fault of the pipes, as all Londoners did when their water tasted unusual. Surely it was only sediment, or the residue of the river, or the trick of a tired palate. But each day the water's sweetness grew bolder, stronger, more persistent. It clung to the spoon after stirring porridge. It settled on the rim of the teacup. It soaked into bread, vegetables, soups, leaving a faint, chalky aftertaste that no amount of herbs or salt could hide. The mistress of the house began to notice her tea tasted different. "Perhaps the blend has spoiled," she murmured, frowning at the cup. She blamed the merchant, then the tin, then her own nerves. She never once suspected the pipes running silently through the walls, each lined with a shimmering layer of lead dissolving grain by grain into the water she drank every morning. The children complained too, though their protests took simpler shapes. "It tastes funny," the eldest whispered, pushing away her cup. The youngest, still unable to articulate discomfort, merely grimaced each time the spoon neared her lips. Their mother coaxed them gently, insisting hot tea would soothe their winter coughs. She did not see the irony. As days passed, the kitchen filled with symptoms no one connected to their source. The cook's arms trembled as she lifted pots from the stove. The scullery maid felt dizzy whenever she ladled water into basins for washing. The children grew pale, shadows deepening beneath their eyes. Even the mother found herself leaning against the kitchen table one morning, breath quickening, vision swimming as she waited for the kettle to boil. The doctor, summoned once more, offered polite theories. "Fatigue from the cold season," he said. "Improper sleep, nervous strain." He tapped his pencil against his notebook, diagnosing everything except the truth. He did not taste the water. He did not inspect the pipes. It never occurred to him that the sweetness in the household tea might be the sweetness of poison. One evening, as the cook prepared broth for supper, a tremor overtook her hand so violently that the ladle clanged against the pot. She gripped the counter, breath ragged. A sheen of sweat appeared on her brow. She looked around the kitchen, the walls painted thick with white, the ceiling stained faintly from steam, the pipes humming softly behind the plaster, and felt a creeping dread she could not explain. She dipped the ladle once more, letting the broth trickle back into the pot. As the steam rose, carrying with it that same gentle sweetness she had dismissed for weeks, she realized something. The kitchen smelled different than it used to. Not richer, not warmer, not fresher. Just sweeter. Always sweeter. And within that sweetness sat the invisible toxin patient, pervasive, dissolving slowly into the water that sustained the home, poisoning each cup, each meal, each breath that drifted through the heart of the house. The kitchen, once a place of nourishment, had become a silent alchemist, turning water into harm, transforming the rituals of daily life into the unknowing consumption of danger. And each morning, as the kettle hissed and the tea steeped, the sweetness returned again, betraying nothing of its deadly intent. The wash-house sat at the back of the property, half sheltered by a sloping roof and half exposed to the winter wind. It was never meant to be a place of comfort. Its flagstone floor remained perpetually damp, and the copper tubs steamed like cauldrons from dawn until dusk. The air smelled of soapsuds, wet linen, and the faint mineral tang of water drawn straight from the pipes that snaked through the ground. But beneath its ordinary labor, the wash-house carried a quiet menace. For it was here, in this dim and steaming space, that leads seeped most easily into the lives of those who worked hardest. The pipes feeding the wash-house were older than those in the main house, thin-walled, tarnished, fatigued by decades of hot water rushing through them. Where the plaster had cracked, one could see the pipes themselves, mottled with white blooms that flaked away at a touch. Each time a servant opened the tap, the water surged forth in a cloudy stream, carrying with it tiny particles invisible in the rising steam, but potent in their ability to harm. The laundress noticed changes long before anyone else. Her hands, once strong and sure, began to feel oddly stiff. The skin beneath her fingernails grew pale, almost bluish, as though frost had settled beneath the flesh. When she plunged linens into the tub, the water stung faintly, not like heat, but like something sharper, something metallic brushing the surface of her skin. She shook off the sensation. There was too much work to consider such things. The laundry of a Victorian household was relentless. Nappies, linens, shirts, petticoats, tablecloths, lace, curtains, each requiring boiling, rinsing, scrubbing, pressing. Steam billowed into the air, curling around her face until her hair clung damply to her temples. She breathed it in deeply, never questioning the way it made her chest tighten. By midday, the washhouse floor trembled with activity. Buckets sloshed, irons hissed. The copper tub boiled over with fragrant foam, but the pipes complained. They rattled, groaned, and occasionally released a sputtering cough of water, darker than it should have been. The laundress pretended not to hear. She had been raised to endure noise, hardship, and exhaustion, never to question the integrity of the home's bones. Yet the consequences crept in. Her breath grew shallow after each day's work, leaving her light-headed by sunset. At night her arms felt weighted, as though she were still dragging sodden sheets from the tub. Her appetite waned, replaced by an ache that settled deep in her joints. The other servants noticed her pallor, her trembling hands, the way she leaned against the washhouse door before entering. "You're just tired," they assured her. "This winter is harsher than most." But winter did not explain the dark crescents under her eyes. It did not explain the dizziness that overtook her each time she bent to scrub a petticoat. It did not explain the peculiar numbness in her fingertips, the very fingertips that touched poisoned water, day after day without protection. Inside the main house, the family remained blissfully unaware. Their linens arrived at their bedsides bleached, pressed, and fragrant. They never saw the clouded water in which those linens had been bathed. They never felt the sting of the steam rising like a silent ghost from the copper tub. One afternoon, as the laundress wrung out a sheet, she felt a sudden jolt of pain shoot up her arm. The sheet dropped from her grip, slapping onto the wet floor. She clutched her wrist, tears filling her eyes, not for the pain itself, but for the fear that she would no longer be able to work. A servant without strength was a servant without purpose, and a servant without purpose risked being cast aside. She steadied herself, forced her hands to obey, and resumed her task. Above her, the pipes trembled again. A thin flake of lead fell from the exposed section and landed silently on the damp floor, dissolving into the puddles at her feet. The washhouse exhaled another plume of steam, thick and whitened by the very poison eroding its pipes. And within that breath, lead travelled effortlessly into lungs, into skin, into the very rhythm of the servant's daily labour. The house remained clean. The linens remained immaculate. And the laundress, surrounded by vapour and decay, continued her work, unaware that each drop of water, each breath of steam, carried her deeper into the quiet, relentless grasp of the invisible toxin. The bedroom was meant to be a sanctuary, a chamber where the noise of the city softened, where coal smoke thinned, where exhaustion dissolved into sleep. But in this house, the sanctuary betrayed its purpose. The walls, painted in the fashionable white favoured by so many London households, gleamed with an almost eerie brightness in the morning light. At night they seemed to pulse faintly, as though breathing with the occupants. And as weeks passed, the family began to sense that something was wrong within those pale boundaries. It started with the tremors. They were not true movements, not enough to rattle the gas sconces or shake the brass bedframe. Instead, the trembling came from within the bodies of the sleepers. The mistress awoke one morning to find her hands shivering beneath the coverlet, fingers twitching, as though responding to a chill that did not exist. Her husband brushed it off as fatigue, but when she reached to button her gown, her fingers refused to obey, fumbling clumsily against the fabric. The youngest child, sleeping in a small bed against the far wall, became restless, her limbs jerking in the night. She cried out sometimes, not in fear, but in confusion, as though dreaming of something she could not escape. When her mother rushed to her, the girl's eyelids fluttered, and she murmured that the room felt too bright, even in total darkness. Still, no one connected the trembling to the walls themselves. The paint had begun to crack in delicate lines, like frost spreading across a window pane. Each crack released specks of white dust, too fine to notice except when caught by a passing sunbeam. The bedroom curtains, heavy with embroidery, trapped the dust, releasing it again when drawn shut at dusk. At night, when breaths grew deeper and the room warmed with slumbering bodies, the dust lifted once more, drifting quietly into the lungs of those who dreamt beneath it. The father suffered the symptoms next. He awoke one night with his heart racing, his breath shallow. Sweat clung to his skin despite the cool air. The tremor in his hands refused to subside. He pressed a hand to the wall for balance, unaware that the very surface he sought for steadiness was leaching poison into every fiber of his being. When he described his symptoms at breakfast, the doctor summoned yet again blamed overwork and prescribed a sedative that only deepened the fog behind his eyes. Meanwhile, the lead dust continued its subtle work. The bedroom floorboards bore faint pale streaks where footsteps disturbed settled particles. The wash basin collected a thin residue overnight, noticed only when the maid scrubbed it away at dawn. Even the pillows carried hints of the toxin, invisible threads that wove themselves into the fabric each time a sleeper shifted. The mother's dreams grew strange, filled with images of bright white rooms and shadows that moved just beyond the edge of sight. She awoke each morning with a metallic taste on her tongue, her limbs heavy, her breath shallow. Yet still, she forced herself through each day, unwilling to believe illness could find her within the supposed safety of her own bedroom. One evening, as she brushed her hair before the mirror, she noticed the reflection wavering not from her own movement, but from the slight tremor in the gas lamp beside her. The light shivered across the gleaming walls. For a moment, she imagined she saw the paint ripple, as though exhaling a slow, poisonous breath. She blinked. The walls were still, but the trembling remained in her fingers. In the quietest moments of the night, when all else fell silent, the room seemed to hum faintly, the way a dying ember emits a last reluctant glow. It was not sound, not motion, simply a presence. The invisible toxin, woven into every inch of the shining walls, continued its patient, merciless work. The bedroom, once a refuge, had become an accomplice, and the family, sleeping peacefully within it, never realized that each breath drew them deeper into the shimmering, silent grasp of the poison they had painted with their own hands. The house had been purchased at a bargain, a narrow townhouse tucked between two larger, more respectable homes. Its owner, a miserly gentleman of advancing years, prided himself on economy rather than taste. Yet even he understood the importance of appearances. A fresh coat of paint, a few gilded trimmings, and a careful polish on the mantelpieces could transform the dwelling into a showpiece, a token of refinement that masked frugality. What he did not anticipate, and what no one warned him, was that his desire to save money would invite calamity through the very walls he sought to beautify. The renovation began on a damp October morning. Painters were hired from the lowest tier of laborers, their tools crude, their techniques hurried. The lead paint they applied was of inferior quality, chalky, prone to flaking, laced with impurities. The miser insisted on using less than the recommended amount for economy's sake, and the workers complied. The result was a coat that appeared bright and even at a glance, but one that concealed a dangerous flaw. Each brushstroke contained the seed of slow, invisible destruction. Within weeks, the paint began to crumble in places. Tiny flakes drifted from sills and door frames, collecting on floors, furniture, and the hands of anyone who touched them. In the nursery, the child's laughter was accompanied by an occasional cough. Her mother, lifting her from the cradle, felt a weakness in her arms that she had not known before. The maid noticed her fingers shaking when she dusted the new mouldings, but she said nothing. There was nothing to be done but continue. The plumber, too, had cut corners, installing pipes that were old and tarnished beneath the thin veneer of new connections. When water flowed, it carried with it fine particles of lead, sweet and metallic on the tongue. Tea, bread, and porridge all became carriers of the toxin, their flavor subtly altered in ways the family could not yet recognize. The house itself seemed complicit, a gilded trap that gleamed with pride while slowly eroding the health of those within. The miser, observing the results, felt satisfaction. "The house looks respectable," he told himself, admiring the evenness of the walls. He did not see the dust swirling in the candlelight, nor the faint pallor creeping across the faces of his household. His penny-wise methods, intended to save money, had amplified the danger, allowing the poison to flourish unchecked in corners and crevices, behind doors and beneath floors. The doctor visited once to inspect the family, noting pallor, headaches, and listless movements. He blamed overwork, anxiety, the damp of London winters, and prescribed rest and tonics. He did not inspect the walls, nor taste the water, nor follow the path of the dust settling on every surface. The house, pristine to the eye, had rendered him blind to its true nature. Even the servants, who labored hardest, felt the slow erosion of their strength. Hands that had carried buckets and polished brass trembled. Knees weakened with repetitive bending. Breath became shallow with the steam rising from the washing tubs. Yet each day they performed their duties, unaware that the house they tended was a silent agent of harm. By night, the home was quiet, but the danger lingered in the warmth of its rooms. The nursery, the parlor, the kitchen, all shone faintly under gaslight, their brilliance unbroken, their surfaces gleaming. And within that brilliance, the dust continued to drift, invisible to the eye but lethal to the body. The miser, pleased with appearances, slept soundly, never imagining that his economy had crafted a chamber of quiet destruction. His frugality had ensured the house would remain pristine only for the eye, while every breath taken within it became a subtle, merciless theft of health. The renovation had been a success, in one sense, and a catastrophe in every other. The mantelpiece gleamed beneath the pale glow of the gas lamp, polished to perfection, adorned with the finest porcelain figurines and a small collection of glass bottles. They were arranged with deliberate care, each representing the household's devotion to the child in the nursery, a newborn, fragile and bright, whose very breath seemed to hang suspended in the still air. The bottles, filled with milk or watered-down tea, promised nourishment. They were the symbols of maternal vigilance and domestic pride. Yet beneath their innocent clarity lay a quiet betrayal. The milk itself was innocuous enough at first glance, freshly drawn and warmed with care. The mother tested it with the tip of her finger before placing it in the glass bottle, thinking only of the child's comfort and safety. She would never have imagined that the water used to dilute or warm the milk carried with it the glimmer of lead particles, a trace, invisible, silent, and far more cunning than any pest or draught that haunted the nursery. By nightfall, the bottles sat neatly on the mantel, lined like sentinels guarding their charge. Moonlight touched their surfaces, creating the illusion of purity, a gentle radiance that mirrored the mother's own pride. She would glance at them before retiring to her own chamber, reassured that each one contained sustenance, life preserved within glass. Yet the very act of sitting there, atop the polished wood, allowed the fine dust drifting from the painted walls to settle upon their rims and caps. Each tiny flake carried the toxin. Each breath the child drew mingled with it, and each sip became an unknowing ingestion of poison. The infant, nestled in the cradle, stirred. The mother bent, lifting her small form with practiced ease, or so she thought. Her arms felt heavier, weighted by fatigue she could not explain. She placed the child gently in her lap, propped the bottle at the tiny lips, and watched as the infant drank. The child sucked eagerly, oblivious to the metallic undertone that the mother could not detect. To her, the bottle seemed a simple conduit for nourishment, a talisman of maternal care. In truth, it was a subtle agent of slow decay. The maid, sweeping the nursery floor, paused when she noticed a faint dusting on the mantelpiece, a residue that had not been there the night before. She raised her eyebrows and brushed it away, unconcerned. Such things were common in a house of painted walls, polished floors, and fireplaces. She did not consider that the same dust might have settled upon the bottles, might have mixed invisibly with the milk, might have been drawn into the lungs of the sleeping child with each tiny breath. Outside the nursery, the city hummed, indifferent. Horses trotted through soot-stained streets. Vendors shouted in the markets. Fog pressed against the windows in persistent folds. Within the home, time moved differently. The bottles remained aligned on the mantelpiece, the milk inside slightly warm from the day's preparation, the glass untouched, yet already compromised. The lead dust in the air settled imperceptibly on the lids, on the glass itself, on the child's tiny hands when curiosity brought them into contact. By morning, the infant's skin bore a subtle pallor. The mother noticed it briefly, attributing it to a restless night, to teething, to the chill of the nursery floor. She poured another bottle of milk, cleaned the previous one with care, and placed it once more on the mantelpiece. The cycle continued, quiet, unnoticed, deadly. In the nursery, life and poison coexisted in delicate balance. The bottles gleamed innocently, and yet each sip, each breath, carried the invisible toxin further into the body of the child, the very one they were meant to protect. The mantelpiece, polished and proud, had become a perch for harm, and the household remained blissfully unaware. It began as a dull, insistent throb behind the temples, a minor discomfort at first, easily dismissed with a cup of tea or a brief respite by the fire. But the pain grew with every passing day, sharper now, rising and falling like the tide. In Victorian households, such ailments were so common that they were often attributed to simple causes: overwork, bad air, the damp chill of London's narrow streets. Yet in this home, the source of the affliction was neither fatigue nor fog. It was the very environment itself, the walls, the pipes, the dust that settled on every surface, carrying with it the invisible weight of lead. The mistress was the first to suffer. She found herself pressing her palms to her forehead during breakfast, her vision blurred by the light of the gas lamp. The air of the parlour seemed thicker, heavier, carrying an unnameable metallic taste that clung to her tongue. She blamed nerves, blamed the season, blamed the restless household. She did not blame the paint that glimmered innocently on the walls, nor the lead that had settled silently into the water she had used for her tea. No one did. Her husband experienced the same torment. While reading the morning paper, he felt a sudden surge of heat in his skull, followed by a dull, persistent ache that refused to dissipate. He reached for the window, attempting to inhale the cooler air outside, yet even that offered little relief. The city, with its fog and coal smoke, provided one kind of irritation, but the true source lay within the home itself, unacknowledged and unseen. Lead dust, carried on the currents of heated air from walls and gas lamps, had invaded every chamber of their domestic life. Children, too, suffered. The eldest complained of splitting headaches after hours spent drawing or playing near the windowsills, the white paint bright in the afternoon sun. The youngest wailed in her cradle, small fists clenching the bedding, brows furrowed in discomfort. Their cries were gentle yet insistent, a chorus of unease that no one could interpret. The mother bent over them, lifting the children in turn, feeling the weight of their bodies in her arms, all the while ignoring the invisible agent that had already begun to affect her own mind and strength. The doctor visited, as was customary when the household ailments persisted. He tapped his notebook with a silver pencil, examined pulse and tongue, listened to chest and belly. He offered diagnoses that sounded plausible: overwork, anxiety, teething, a touch of fever. He prescribed tonics, thick with sugar and laudanum, suggesting rest and fresh air. But he did not inspect the paint, the water, the pipes. He did not inhale the fumes rising from walls heated by the evening hearth or gas lamp. He could not name what he had never seen. Even the servants were affected, though less noticed. Their labor continued, a silent endurance of a creeping malaise. The maid, polishing the stairs or dusting the mantels, often paused mid-task, pressing a hand to her head where the ache throbbed insistently. She wiped sweat from her brow, murmuring excuses for the delay, and resumed, the invisible toxin already embedding itself further into her body. By dusk, the house hummed with quiet suffering. Footsteps echoed along the polished floors, hands trembled over teacups, eyes blinked against dull throb, and still the rooms gleamed with deceptive perfection. The brilliance of the paint, the warmth of the gas lamps, the cleanliness of the linens, all masked a subtle, unrelenting menace. The headaches, violent and uncomprehended, were only the first hint of the poison's patient, methodical work. And so, night after night, the household endured. The walls shimmered innocently in candle and gaslight, the air carried its metallic sweetness silently, and the invisible lead, patient and unrelenting, continued to claim its toll on the minds, bodies, and nerves of all who dwelled within the home, leaving no one untouched by its quiet, merciless hand. The wallpaper, once admired for its delicate pattern of curling vines and soft florals, had become a quiet accomplice to the household's suffering. Each sheet, meticulously aligned and pressed with careful hands, shimmered faintly in the gaslight, as though it carried a subtle life of its own. Mothers, servants, and children alike moved through the rooms with confidence, convinced that beauty could never harm them. Yet it was within the very fibers of this paper, the pigments, the powders, the fine metallic dust, that illness had begun its patient, relentless work. It began in the nursery, where the youngest child played beneath the patterned walls. Flakes of paint and paper dust loosened imperceptibly, falling onto the carpet, onto the toys, into the infant's small hands. Each time she touched the walls, rubbed a finger along a line of trim, or crawled beneath the low windowsill, she carried with her invisible particles into her mouth, her lungs, her body. Her mother, tending to chores nearby, noticed nothing more than occasional smudges on the furniture or the child's cheeks. The effects were subtle at first. The child became irritable, less willing to play, her laughter muted. She tired more quickly, her limbs seeming heavier than before. The mother, ever vigilant, blamed teething, restless nights, or the chill that pressed through the windows. The maid, cleaning and dusting, began to cough quietly, a faint wheeze that she attributed to the lingering steam from the wash-house. No one, not even the visiting physician, could identify the true cause, for the sickness followed a path unseen, slipping silently from the paper, through the air, into flesh and bone. The parlour, once the pride of the home, was no less compromised. Guests who leaned too close to admire the intricate designs occasionally complained of dizziness, of headaches that came on without warning. Children learning their letters at the writing desk grew pale and lethargic, their fingers curling strangely around the quill. The family dismissed these ailments, unaware that each exposure, each breath drawn within the papered walls, compounded the invisible poison already coursing through their veins. Even the adults were not immune. The mother, exhausted from constant vigilance, noticed a faint tremor in her hands, particularly when she pressed them against the wall while adjusting the frames or straightening the draperies. Her husband experienced headaches that persisted well into the evening, and a metallic taste lingered on his tongue after sipping tea near the windowsill. Yet each observed symptom was treated in isolation, as if the house itself were innocent. The wallpaper, patient and unyielding, continued to shed its particles. Each day, the living space accumulated a layer of poison so fine it could not be seen, but its effects became increasingly apparent in the trembling hands, pallid faces, and persistent fatigue of the household. The decorative pattern, intended to please the eye and elevate the spirit, had transformed into a silent conveyor of sickness, spreading through rooms with the precision of a serpent coiling around its prey. By dusk, the household moved through the rooms with practiced care, sweeping, dusting, and polishing, unknowingly stirring more particles into the air. The shimmering walls continued to glow, unblemished to the casual observer, hiding the gradual erosion of health beneath their pristine surface. Each breath taken, each touch upon the papered walls, carried the invisible toxin deeper into the bodies of those who lived among its beauty. And so the sickness followed the wallpaper, patient, unrelenting, hidden beneath the guise of elegance. It became a quiet rhythm of life, exposure and exhaustion, beauty and decay, health and hidden danger, all intertwined within the gilded, patterned walls that promised refinement, yet delivered silent, unceasing harm. It was in the quiet moments just after dawn, when the sun pierced the fog and light streamed obliquely through lace curtains, that the truth of the house revealed itself most cruelly. What had seemed pristine in the gaslit glow of evening now shimmered with a subtle accusation. Tiny particles floated lazily in the shafts of light, glinting like fine frost against the polished floors and the smooth, white-painted walls. To the casual eye, it was nothing more than dust, a common feature of any London household. Yet it was the dust of lead, and in its delicate, almost imperceptible glimmer lay the silent theft of health and vitality. The mother, carrying a tray of breakfast tea, paused mid-step. The sun's rays fell across the mantelpiece, illuminating the pale haze that hovered above the glass bottles she had so carefully arranged the night before. She frowned, brushing at her sleeve, as though that would suffice to disperse the air's quiet accusation. But the dust refused to be tamed. It rose with each movement of the tray, twisting in the light, clinging to fingers, settling into the weave of the carpet, the folds of the children's clothing. The children, drawn to the dancing motes, stretched out their small hands to grasp the brightness. The eldest giggled softly, watching the dust swirl, while the youngest, too small to articulate curiosity, simply rubbed her palms together, unknowingly transferring the metallic particles to her mouth and cheeks. The mother's heart twisted with a mixture of pride and unease, pride in her careful arrangement, unease she could not yet name. Even the servants noticed the morning haze. The maid, broom in hand, paused at the foot of the stairs. Her breath came short and shallow, her chest tight from a nagging cough that seemed to worsen with each sweep of the brush. Tiny specks clung to her uniform, her hair, her hands. She glanced up at the sunlight streaming through the window, wondering briefly if the house itself had conspired against her, but dismissed the thought. After all, the household had always been meticulous. Dust, she reasoned, was simply unavoidable. In the parlor, the father set the newspaper on the table, blinking against the shafts of light that revealed a fine, shimmering film across the polished wood. He lifted a hand, touched the surface, and recoiled slightly as a faint grey powder coated his fingertips. He coughed, clearing his throat, attributing the discomfort to London's fog pressing through the open window. He did not consider that the house itself had conspired, in its silent, patient way, to seep poison into the air he breathed. By midday, the consequences of the dawn's revelation were felt throughout the household. Headaches throbbed behind weary eyes. Hands shook imperceptibly as utensils were lifted or teacups set down. Fatigue clung to the body with a stubborn persistence, a slow and insidious weight that no rest could entirely lift. The light that revealed the dust also highlighted its reach across surfaces, into fabrics, onto the skin, and eventually into the bloodstream of all who dwelled within the house. Yet, the house itself remained calm, gleaming, innocent to the untrained eye. The paint on the walls glimmered proudly, the wooden floors reflected the sun's brilliance, and the mantelpieces, now dusted with the fine, metallic powder, continued to display their curated ornaments as if untouched by the quiet, relentless threat that had come to inhabit every inch of the rooms. In that daylight, for the first time, the household had a glimpse of the invisible. Not a full understanding, not yet, but a hint, a whisper of the danger that lingered in beauty, in order, in care, and the lead dust, patient and imperceptible, settled once more, waiting for the next brush, the next breath, the next moment when its quiet work could continue without notice. The morning revealed too much, and yet, in its brilliance, it revealed nothing at all of the poison that thrived in the very heart of the home. Before dawn, when the city was still wrapped in mist and the cobblestones glistened with dew, the lead mills began their labor. Their chimneys exhaled faint plumes that mingled with the London fog, sending ribbons of smoke curling across the streets. From afar, the buildings appeared industrious, noble, even a testament to progress, to trade, to the city's ceaseless appetite for improvement. But beneath the proud facades and the polished wheels of machinery, the mills breathed a hidden poison into the air, into the hands of the workers, and eventually into the homes of every unsuspecting Londoner. Inside, men stirred vats of white lead, scraping thick layers from the metal pans, grinding it with stone rollers. The mixture was smooth, almost silken, gleaming under the dim oil lamps hung above the benches. To the workers, it promised wages, sustenance, and the pride of labor. Yet each stroke of the spatula, each rotation of the wheel, released clouds of fine dust that rose silently, climbing to the beams above and drifting across the stone floors. The air was thick with it, invisible yet potent, sweet and metallic in the nose, clinging stubbornly to skin, clothing, and hair. The apprentices, boys scarcely taller than the vats themselves, worked with careful attention, their small hands coated in the fine powder. One boy rubbed his eyes, wincing as the dust flared across the membranes, stinging faintly. He coughed into his sleeve, ignoring the persistent dryness that settled in his throat. The master saw and said nothing. The work must continue. The city demanded it, and the boys complied, unaware that each inhalation, each contact, each careless brushing of the powder from a sleeve carried the seeds of illness into their fragile bodies. Outside, the fog clung to the mill buildings, dense and damp, weaving between horse-drawn carts and gas lamps. It carried with it tiny motes of lead that had escaped through open windows and vents. The city inhaled them in quiet ignorance. Street sweepers, pedestrians, and market children breathed the same metallic sweetness, unaware of the slow corruption taking hold beneath their ribs, in their nerves, in their developing bones. In the upper floors, clerks handled ledgers and invoices, their fingers brushing freshly milled pigments stored in small containers for delivery to homes and workshops. The dust clung stubbornly to ink-stained hands, transferring onto paper, onto the quills used to record the day's transactions. Even in the offices, the poison spread silently, a pale companion to the city's commerce. By midday, the workers felt the effects in small, insidious ways. Headaches throbbed behind eyes reddened by the dim light. Joints ached from the repetitive labor, trembling at times that seemed inexplicable. Fatigue weighed heavily, deeper than mere exertion should account for. Yet there was no pause, no reprieve. The lead demanded obedience, and the city's economy demanded the lead. The mills continued their work, grinding, mixing, sifting, turning raw metal into the brightness that would soon coat walls, cradles, pipes, and windowsills. And from the chimneys, the air carried it outward, drifting into the city's narrow streets and fog-laden lanes, into homes where mothers, fathers, and children would unknowingly inhale it with every breath. The mill was both creator and distributor of beauty, of domestic pride, but also of suffering, subtle and relentless. London, still half asleep beneath the morning fog, received it with innocence, unaware of how deeply it would insinuate itself into the rhythm of daily life. The lead mills labored tirelessly, their smoke entwined with the mist. And as the sun rose above the city, the invisible toxin had already begun its quiet conquest, reaching far beyond the walls of the mill, settling everywhere that London would come to call home. The boiler room was the heart of the pigment house, dark, hot, and suffused with the pungent scent of metals softened by fire. Here, vats of lead white swirled endlessly, churned by men whose muscles had long adapted to the unrelenting rhythm of labor. The room steamed, thick with heat and moisture, and the air was perpetually laced with a subtle metallic tang, sweet and faintly clinging to the tongue. The workers breathed it in unconsciously, and yet each inhalation carried with it a silent promise of harm. The master of the boiler, a man with broad shoulders and a face lined with soot, oversaw the operation with quiet precision. Each day, he ensured the fire beneath the vats roared steadily, that the thick pigment remained in perpetual motion, that the apprentices rotated in shifts to avoid fatigue. But even he could not halt the invisible danger rising from the bubbling mixture. Minute particles of lead floated upwards with the steam, escaping through cracks in the iron lids, drifting lazily around the room before settling on the exposed skin and clothing of anyone who remained too long. The apprentices, still small and pliant, felt the subtle sting of the metal in the air. Their hands, immersed in the thick cream of pigment, grew stiff and pale. They coughed quietly into their sleeves, trying to dismiss the dryness in their throats, the heaviness in their heads. Some rubbed their eyes, only to smear a fine dust across their eyelids that clung stubbornly, irritating and persistent. Yet the work continued, inexorable, because to falter meant punishment, and in this place the master's eyes tolerated no hesitation. The boiler hummed and hissed, a constant companion to the laborers. The heat from the fire softened the pigment, releasing a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer into the air. In the light of a single oil lamp, the particles glittered like snowflakes frozen mid-fall, deceptively delicate. They coated the floorboards, the edges of tubs, the rungs of ladders, and, most dangerously, the skin of those who handled the mixture day after day. Lead, so smooth, so pliable, was also merciless. Outside, the morning fog mingled with the faint wisps of smoke escaping the tall chimneys, carrying fine particles into the streets of London. Pedestrians breathed it, street vendors spread it unknowingly with every step along the wet cobblestones, and homes beyond the factory's walls began to accumulate the invisible burden. By the time a painted door frame gleamed in a modest parlor, the poison had already worked its way into every body it touched. In the boiler room itself, the toll became increasingly apparent. The master noticed his men's pallor deepening. The apprentices' movements grew sluggish. Their fingers trembled as they lifted heavy paddles, struggled with the viscosity of the pigment. One young boy collapsed beside the vat, clutching his head as a dull, relentless ache pressed from within. The master merely placed a hand on his shoulder, whispering that a short rest would suffice, unaware that the cause was far beyond ordinary fatigue. Each day, as the pigment thickened and swirled under the iron lids, the burden of its toxicity spread silently through the bodies of those who tended it. The very substance that promised beauty and wealth, the brilliant lead white, demanded its toll with a patient, unyielding hand. Hands, lungs, and bones alike became vessels of the invisible menace, their owners unaware that each shift at the boiler brought them closer to permanent harm. The fire roared, the pigment churned, and the air shimmered faintly with dust too fine to be seen. In that heat, that stillness, that relentless labor, the men were caught in a slow, unceasing conquest, their bodies bending under the weight of the very brightness that London would one day admire in its homes. The boiler carried its burden quietly, patiently, mercilessly, and the city beyond breathed in its gift, ignorant of the cost. In the workshop's lower room, the air was thick with steam and the faint scent of kiln smoke. Shelves lined with pots, jugs, and delicate porcelain vases gleamed under the gas lamps, their surfaces smooth and glossy from the careful application of glaze. To the casual observer, the room was a testament to craftsmanship, hands trained over years, eyes trained to spot the slightest imperfection. Yet beneath the beauty lay a secret so insidious that it could kill quietly, invisibly, without a word. The glaze itself was prized for its luster, its brightness, the way it reflected candlelight and sunlight alike. It promised perfection, a sheen that would make a simple cup appear precious, a humble jug resemble treasure. And the source of that brilliance lead was nearly universal. Lead gave the pottery its smooth finish, its creamy surface, its shine that delighted the eye. But the very substance that enhanced beauty carried a hidden bite, an unperceived venom that worked its way into flesh and bone with every careless brush stroke, every inhale of the fine, metallic dust. The apprentices, boys and girls barely tall enough to reach the low shelves, dipped brushes into the glistening glaze. They applied it with precision, unaware that the smallest gesture released clouds of fine powder into the air. Each sweep of the brush stirred particles that clung to skin, settled on their hair, and entered their lungs with every breath. They coughed quietly into their sleeves, rubbed their eyes, and continued working, the invisible poison accumulating steadily with each passing hour. The master potter, overseeing the operation, moved methodically between benches. He checked for bubbles in the glaze, for uneven coatings, for flaws that might diminish the value of the work. He smelled the air faintly, inhaled the steam rising from the kiln, yet never questioned the metallic sweetness that lingered on his tongue or clung faintly to his fingers. He did not see the way the apprentices' hands trembled more with each shift, nor how the children grew paler as the week wore on. When the kiln door opened to inspect a firing, a rush of heated air carried the accumulated particles into the broader room. They swirled around the gas lamps, glinting faintly like suspended snowflakes, before settling onto the already glazed surfaces. The pots, vessels of artistry and labor, became unwilling carriers of the toxin, their beauty masking the danger that lingered in every fiber of the workshop. By afternoon, the consequences began to manifest. The apprentices complained of headaches, of fatigue, of nausea they could not explain. Their parents would remark on pale cheeks or the tremor in small hands, blaming it on hunger, on the chill of the workshop, on the strain of their long hours. Yet none suspected that the very work intended to teach skill and patience was the source of their suffering. Even the master, for all his experience, felt the subtle weight in his chest as he inhaled the heated air, the dull ache behind his eyes, the tingling in his fingertips. He attributed it to overwork, to long hours in the heat of the kiln, to the strain of teaching and labor. But the lead, silent, patient, merciless, continued its quiet work, embedding itself into the bones and blood of all who labored within the workshop's walls. Outside, London went about its day unaware. Market vendors, children, and servants would eventually carry glazed wares into homes, bringing with them the invisible burden hidden beneath the brilliant surface. The pottery, beautiful and admired, became a Trojan horse, delivering the poison of lead to the very hearths meant to nurture life. The workshop hummed with quiet industry. Brushes moved, kilns hissed, glaze dripped and settled. And everywhere, the hidden bite persisted, patient, persistent, and utterly unobserved, turning art into a vessel of silent harm that would ripple through the homes and bodies of Victorian London. In the heat and shadow of the smelter, the men laboured with the solemnity of priests tending to an altar. The furnaces glowed like miniature suns, casting a fiery light across the brick floors and iron vats. The air was thick with the scent of molten metal, of coal smoke, of sweat and ash mingled with something subtler, something sweet and metallic that clung invisibly to skin, lungs, and clothing. It was in this glow, in this perpetual furnace of labour, that the poison revealed itself most cruelly, manifesting first in the tremor of hands. The smelter, a robust man of middle years, prided himself on precision. Each pour of molten lead required steady fingers, unwavering attention, and a mind free of distraction. Yet the metal itself, heated and liquid, released a fine vapor that settled imperceptibly upon the skin and into the pores of anyone who stood too close. The hands that once lifted heavy ladles with ease now quivered ever so slightly. The tremor was faint, almost polite, almost ignorable but persistent, a whisper of the poison accumulating silently in bones, muscles, and nerves. The apprentices watched the master as he dipped the ladle into the glowing vat, carrying it to the mold with measured care. Their own hands shook in imitation, whether from fear, fatigue, or the invisible weight of lead infiltrating their muscles. They could not distinguish. Small motes floated upward, drifting through the air in lazy spirals, catching in the curls of hair, settling on the damp collars of shirts, the cuffs of sleeves. They were too fine to see clearly, too subtle to provoke concern, yet each inhalation drew them deeper into the body's interior, a quiet enemy at work. Each day, the smelter's tremor grew imperceptibly stronger. He compensated by tightening his grip, by shifting the weight of the ladle into his forearm, by pausing more often to steady himself. Sweat beaded his forehead, mixing with the soot and the metallic tang, dripping onto the brick floor, where it mingled with the dust that had settled long before his arrival. The apprentices whispered among themselves, but such matters were not discussed openly. To acknowledge the tremor was to admit weakness, and weakness in the smelter's workshop could be dangerous, both socially and professionally. Outside, the furnaces exhaled plumes of heat and vapor into the early morning fog, carrying invisible particles far beyond the walls of the building. Streets filled with horses, carts, and pedestrians breathed the same metallic air, the poison drifting silently into homes, shops, and schools. London itself, wrapped in mist and soot, inhaled with casual indifference the very substance that would, over time, haunt its citizens in every household, painted with the lead produced here. By nightfall, the smelter's hands shook visibly, his wrists stiff with fatigue and tingling with the subtle effects of accumulated lead. Yet he continued his labor, filling molds, pouring molten streams, scraping residue from vats. Each motion stirred the air, releasing further particles, sending them upward to mingle with the warm night and the inhalations of those nearby. The apprentices followed, dutiful and unaware, their small bodies slowly compromised, their futures unknowingly shaped by the silent work of the molten metal. Even the master, seasoned and experienced, began to notice the dull ache in his joints, the persistent headache that no rest could fully alleviate, the weakness that clung to his fingers. He blamed the work, the heat, the season, but never the substance he so carefully tended. Lead, patient and merciless, had claimed him and those under his charge, embedding itself in the very rhythm of the smelter's life. The furnaces glowed, the ladles moved, and the trembling hands labored on. And the invisible toxin, silent, persistent, unyielding, continued its patient conquest of all who worked within the glowing heart of the smelter's domain. The boy had begun his apprenticeship with bright eyes and nimble fingers, eager to learn the craft of mixing, grinding, and preparing pigments that would adorn the finest homes in London. He arrived each morning before the first light, stepping carefully over the wet cobblestones that led to the pigment house, inhaling the mist that clung stubbornly to the city. He carried hope in his small chest, though it was already weighted by the knowledge that the master's gaze would not tolerate error. What he did not know was that the very air he drew into his lungs was laced with a poison patient enough to wait for years. At first, the change in him was subtle. His cheeks, once ruddy with youth, began to pale ever so slightly. His fingers, previously deft and steady, trembled faintly as he handled the wooden paddles and brushes. When he sneezed or coughed, the sound was soft, almost imperceptible amidst the clatter of the mills and the hiss of the pigment boilers. Yet the effects were accumulating, slow, invisible, relentless. Each inhalation of dust-laden air carried lead deep into his blood, settling in his bones and nerves, laying claim to strength he would not realize he had lost until weeks later. The apprentices worked under harsh conditions. Steam rose from the vats, curling in serpentine ribbons around their small figures. The air was warm and heavy, filled with the smell of molten metal and powder, with the faint, sweet tang of lead that no one questioned. They stirred, sifted, and poured with meticulous care, unaware that each motion stirred invisible clouds that hovered in the space around them. The boy turned his face from the plume rising from the boiler, coughing softly into his sleeve. Yet he breathed nonetheless. The particles clung to his damp hair, his collar, his hands, and through each contact, the poison claimed another portion of him. By midday, the boy's weakness had become more apparent. His legs wobbled beneath him as he climbed the steps to reach the high shelves of pigment containers. His chest felt tight, each breath shallower than the last. He paused, resting a trembling hand against the iron railing, and blinked rapidly at the steam curling from the kiln. The master glanced up, noting the tremor, but attributed it to hunger or fatigue. In the world of the mill, weakness was common, but it was rarely cause for alarm, certainly not for a boy whose skin had begun to pale in a way that suggested something far more insidious. He ignored the dizziness, forcing himself to continue. His hands shook as he carried heavy bowls of pigment to the mixing station, small flecks clinging to his sleeves and rolling across the stone floor. Each step disturbed the dust that had settled in invisible layers across the workshop. The boy inhaled it again and again, unwittingly drawing the invisible threat deeper into his body with every breath. By evening, he felt light-headed, the tremor now noticeable even to himself. His small shoulders slumped, his steps faltered. Yet when he looked upon the shelves of pristine pigment, when he touched the glistening vats and admired the sheen on the prepared powders, he felt a faint pride. He believed in the craft, in the work, in the promise of mastery. He did not see the cost exacted silently by the metal that lent brilliance to the colors he so carefully prepared. The master extinguished the lamps and ordered the apprentices home. The boy trudged through the fog-laden streets, his face pale beneath the faint glow of gaslight. He felt a chill settle deep into his bones, one that no coat or scarf could ward off. And yet he did not suspect that the colorlessness creeping across his cheeks, the trembling in his fingers, and the shallow rhythm of his breath were gifts of the very substance he had devoted himself to handling. The apprentice had turned pale, and the invisible toxin, patient, relentless, unyielding, had claimed another vessel in its quiet conquest of Victorian life. The factory rose from the mist like a looming colossus, its tall chimneys slicing through the early morning fog, exhaling smoke and heat into the streets of London. Within its walls, the machinery groaned and hissed, the wheels turning with relentless precision. And yet, Above the din, a single whistle pierced the air, a sharp, commanding note that summoned labourers from their lodgings, calling them to their duties. To most, it was merely a signal marking the start of the day, the pulse of industry, the heartbeat of commerce. But within that sound lay a prelude to suffering, for the factory's work and the air it exhaled carried an invisible burden, the slow, inexorable whisper of lead. The apprentices and labourers arrived in hurried lines, shoulders hunched against the chill, breath visible in the frosty air. They passed beneath the iron gates, inhaling the scent of coal, damp timber, and the faint sweetness of metal in the wind. Already, the particles of lead had escaped from vats, powders, and pipes, drifting from the factory's heart into every corner of the building. By the time the whistle cried, signalling the commencement of work, the toxin was present in the lungs, on the skin, and clinging to hair and clothing of each new arrival. Inside, the heat was oppressive, the noise deafening, and the air thick with vapor rising from kilns, vats, and smelters. The workers bent over their stations, lifting buckets of pigment, grinding powders, applying glazes, or stirring molten metals. Every motion stirred dust-laden air into circulation. Invisible clouds hovered near the ceiling, clinging stubbornly to rafters, falling only when displaced by the movement of limbs or the draft from an open door. The factory was alive, and so too was the poison, moving with the rhythm of labor, patient as a predator, waiting for its prey. The master called the apprentices to attention, gesturing to the vats and machinery, directing the labor with precision. Hands trembled even as they obeyed, eyes watering not from exertion, but from the subtle irritation of inhaled particles. The youngest workers, small and eager, were particularly vulnerable. Their pale fingers shook over brushes and scoops, their lungs filled with the warm, metallic air, and yet the work continued unbroken. The whistle had sounded. They could not pause. By mid-morning, the effects became impossible to ignore. Workers complained of headaches behind their eyes, faint aches in their limbs, dizziness that made their footing uncertain. The youngest apprentices turned pale, pressing their hands to cheeks that had once been ruddy with youth. One man stumbled, narrowly catching himself on the edge of a vat. A cough rose in the back of the room, soft at first, then insistent. Yet the factory roared on, indifferent, and the whistle would sound again at midday, marking the pause in labor, only to restart the rhythm of exposure. Outside, the city continued its daily pulse. Horses clattered over wet cobblestones. Merchants opened their shops. Fog lingered along the streets, carrying away nothing, for the very air was laden with particles that had escaped the factory walls. Those who lived near the building breathed the same invisible dust, carrying it home to kitchens, parlors, and nurseries. The poison followed them as faithfully as a shadow. By evening, the workers emerged, sweat-soaked, trembling, faces pale. They returned to their homes, often too exhausted to notice the subtle tremor of their hands or the dull ache behind their temples. The factory, dark and quiet now, had exhaled another day of invisible harm into the bodies of those it depended upon. The whistle, silent for the night, had announced not only the beginning of labor, but the relentless toll that each day exacted. The factory had sung its metallic note, the city had answered, and the invisible toxin had marched onward, patient, unyielding, and utterly indifferent to the lives it claimed with every blast of the whistle. When the city slept beneath a thick fog, the paintworks came alive. The midnight shift began quietly, with only the low hum of machinery and the occasional hiss of a gas lamp to disturb the darkness. In the narrow alleyways outside, the damp clung to coats and boots, curling into the fog like a ghostly prelude. Inside, the air was warmer, heavier, suffused with the metallic tang of lead and the faint sweetness of pigment stirred by human hands. It was in this stillness, under the pale glare of lamps, that the poison moved most effectively, settling upon workers' skin and clothing, entering lungs unchallenged, and weaving itself into the rhythm of labor. The apprentices arrived first, pale-faced and eager, their hands already trembling from the anticipation of the work ahead. Each one carried a small lantern, the soft glow illuminating the powders and vats, the brushes and palettes, the thin film of dust clinging to every surface. The master unlocked the doors, admitting them into a room that seemed larger in the hush of night, yet oppressive in its quiet, metallic odor. Here, the lead dust floated freely, lifted gently by the warmth of lamps and the motion of hands. They began with the preparation of pigments, stirring thick vats until the mixtures shimmered like liquid cream. Every stroke of the spatula, every turn of the roller, released invisible clouds that hung lazily in the air. The apprentices coughed softly, rubbing their eyes, their delicate skin already tinged with the faint pallor of early exposure. Lead settled into the creases of their gloves, into the cuffs of their sleeves, and, inevitably, into the pores of their skin. Each inhalation carried it deeper, embedding it silently into the bloodstream. The master moved among them, checking mixtures, adjusting brushes, nodding in approval. He inhaled the same metallic sweetness, ignored the subtle aches in his own wrists, and felt nothing amiss. To him, the night's labor was ordinary, routine, necessary. The poison, patient and invisible, did not require acknowledgement. It worked regardless of attention or intention. Hours passed. The city outside remained quiet, unaware of the tiny clouds rising from the paintworks. The moon peeked faintly through grimy windows, casting long shadows across tables and shelves. The apprentices, working silently under its glow, became increasingly pale. Their heads ached, shoulders trembled, and yet they continued, compelled by the master's vigilance and the weight of expectation. Fatigue set in, subtle but insistent, threading its way through limbs and nerves. Some whispered complaints, soft enough to be ignored, others gritted their teeth in silence. The paint itself glistened under the lamps, brilliant and smooth. It promised beauty and refinement for parlours, nurseries, and kitchens across London. Yet each jar, each tin, each carefully prepared batch carried a secret, a trace of lead so fine it could escape detection, yet potent enough to linger in the air, on hands, and eventually in the homes that awaited delivery. By the end of the shift, the apprentices staggered out into the fog-laden streets, shaking, pallid, breath shallow. The master extinguished the lamps and locked the doors, satisfied with the night's work, unaware of the slow toll it had taken on those who labored within. The air in the paintwork settled, the particles drifting down to coat tables, floors, and vats, waiting to rise again with the next stirring, the next brushstroke, the next night. And so the midnight shift continued, unobserved, unchallenged, with the invisible poison moving steadily through the lives of those who tended it. In the hushed hours, beauty and danger entwined, leaving the workers, and eventually the city itself, bound to the quiet, relentless march of lead. He sat behind a polished desk, the lamplight glinting off the brass fittings and the deep mahogany surface. To visitors, he appeared the very embodiment of Victorian propriety, stern, precise, and impeccably dressed. His factory hummed behind the walls, a steady pulse of industry and order. And yet, while the men and apprentices labored beneath the weight of lead-laden air, he dismissed the first murmurs of illness as mere fatigue, a passing discomfort from long hours, cold mornings, or a lack of proper rest. In truth, he was blind to the slow, creeping poison that wove itself through the bones of his employees, invisible but relentless. The apprentices arrived, carrying brushes, spatulas, and small lanterns to illuminate the vast vats of pigment. Their steps were hesitant, their shoulders slumped, and the faint pallor on their cheeks betrayed the early toll of the metal dust that clung to every surface of the workshop. One boy rubbed his temples, a subtle tremor in his fingers betraying the strain he could not yet name. The master glanced up, noting the gestures, and dismissed them. "Nonsense," he said, voice crisp and final. "You work too hard. Take care not to let idle worry distract you." The words carried authority, and the apprentices obeyed, unaware that the fatigue he dismissed was more than exhaustion. It was the first whisper of sickness seeded by lead. The work continued in the dim glow of gas lamps. Vats were stirred, pigments poured, brushes dragged across freshly prepared surfaces. The dust rose in faint, almost ethereal clouds, swirling lazily around the room, settling again with each turn of the wheel, each movement of a hand. The air was warm, heavy, and sweetly metallic, a scent invisible to most, but potent enough to infiltrate lungs and skin. The apprentices inhaled, unconsciously drawing the poison deeper into their bodies. The master remained untouched by these subtle effects, insulated by his distance, his authority, and his unawareness. By midday, the effects of exposure had begun to manifest more clearly. A young man coughed faintly into his sleeve, his chest tight with discomfort. Another rubbed his wrists, shaking as the tremor grew, small flecks of dust clinging to his skin. Yet the employer continued his rounds with the same brisk detachment, offering advice on technique, praise for diligence, and reminders to finish the day's quota. "Mere fatigue," he muttered under his breath, convinced that nothing more sinister could afflict those under his care. Outside, the fog clung stubbornly to the streets, carrying with it the faint particles that escaped the factory's open windows and vents. Pedestrians, street sweepers, and the families of workers all inhaled the same metallic sweetness, spreading the invisible hazard through homes, nurseries, parlors, and kitchens. The city itself remained oblivious, unaware that the master's dismissive words had allowed the slow conquest of lead to continue unchecked. By evening, the apprentices trudged home, their steps heavy, hands trembling, heads throbbing with the first clear symptoms of what they could not yet understand. Some leaned against walls, gasping for breath, while others wiped sweat and dust from their palms, unaware of how much of the invisible toxin had entered their bodies. And in his office, the employer closed his ledger, pleased with the day's work, oblivious to the toll his indifference had exacted. He called it fatigue, but fatigue was only the beginning. The true cost, the slow, patient march of lead through the lungs, the nerves, and the bones of every laborer, would reveal itself long after the day's work had ended, leaving the unsuspecting victims to bear the consequences of beauty, industry, and the blind insistence of authority. The cart rattled along the narrow, fog-choked streets of London, wheels clattering against uneven cobblestones, its burden unseen yet potent. In the early morning, the fog hung heavy and damp, curling around the iron rims and the driver's cloak, clinging to everything it touched. The cart bore barrels of freshly prepared lead-white pigment, their surfaces gleaming faintly under the dim glow of gas lamps, their contents smooth and bright. To the unknowing eye, it was merely commerce, a necessary instrument of industry, a vehicle delivering beauty to parlors, nurseries, and workshops across the city. But within that delivery lay a quiet menace, an invisible companion that followed every street, every corner, every household. The driver, his gloved hands stiff from the cold, guided the horses with the practiced ease of one who had traced these routes countless times. He had long grown accustomed to the peculiar metallic tang in the air, inhaling it unconsciously, unaware that each breath carried the faintest trace of the poison that would follow him into every home the pigment would touch. The barrels, though sealed as well as possible, released microscopic particles with each jolt of the wheels, a whispering dust that floated and settled on surfaces, on clothing, on anyone who drew near. The apprentices who assisted with unloading had pale fingers already stained by weeks of labor. They lifted each barrel carefully, placing them in storage rooms or workshops where the pigment would be used to prepare paints and glazes for domestic interiors. As they handled the material, fine dust escaped into the air, clinging to skin and hair, to the lining of their coats, to the fabric of the barrels themselves. Each inhalation, each touch, was a quiet deposit of harm, accumulating day by day, household by household. In the homes that awaited delivery, servants carried buckets and tubs of pigment to parlors and nurseries, kitchens and workshops. They wiped surfaces, stirred mixtures, and spread paint over walls, floors, and moldings. Every motion dislodged more of the invisible dust, allowing it to drift lazily through the air and settle again. Children playing nearby, mothers cleaning, men preparing morning tea, all inhaled, unknowingly participating in the slow conquest of lead that had begun in the mills and followed through the streets upon the wheels of the cart. By midday, the effects were becoming increasingly evident. A child coughed softly after brushing against a freshly painted windowsill. A mother felt her hands tremble while dusting the mantelpiece. The apprentice staggered slightly while carrying a full pail of pigment, his breath shallow, his arms weighted by an invisible hand. Yet no one knew the source. The cart, mundane and unassuming, had delivered the substance that animated the city's interiors, spreading its quiet menace under the guise of utility and industry. Even the city beyond the immediate households was touched. Pedestrians passing the factory gates and market lanes drew in the lingering metallic scent, unwitting carriers of the fine particles that adhered to coats, cloaks, and gloves. London itself inhaled, brushed against, and carried the poison through streets, homes, and workshops, unaware that beauty, progress, and industry had conspired to embed it invisibly in the rhythm of daily life. The cart continued its rounds, faithful to its purpose, indifferent to the harm it carried. From the mills to the workshops, from the streets to the homes, the dust traveled patiently, relentlessly, and invisibly. The city, gleaming with the brightness of freshly painted walls and polished surfaces, remained unaware that the very substance it celebrated for elegance and refinement had infiltrated its bodies, its children, its servants, and its most domestic corners. The cart carried home the dust, and with it, the invisible toxin continued its quiet conquest of Victorian life, patient, unyielding, and utterly unobserved. By mid-morning, London seemed transformed into a city of snow, though the flakes were not white, soft, or cold. They were fine, pale, metallic, drifting from chimneys, factories, and the carts that carried the day's commerce. The fog, ever faithful to the Thames, clung to rooftops, curling around lampposts, weaving through narrow alleyways. In the half-light, the streets glimmered faintly, as if dusted with frost, but this snow settled in bodies as much as on stone, invisible to the eye yet persistent, patient, and fatal. Inside homes, the effects of the industrial snow became apparent in the trembling hands of housemaids, the pallor of children, the faint headaches that visited parents who, in their pride, never suspected the source. Lead, produced in the mills and carried through the city by carts and labor, now permeated the very atmosphere, drifting in sunlight, swirling in the candlelight, settling into every crevice and fabric. The industrial snow was everywhere, on floors, on shelves, on brass knobs and polished wood, silently infiltrating lungs and bloodstreams. Servants emerged from the kitchens and laundries, dusting their hands on aprons streaked with pale powder. The laundress, returning from the washhouse, coughed softly as the vapor rising from heated water carried flecks of lead into her lungs. The child playing in the nursery brushed a hand along the freshly painted wainscoting, drawing particles into the skin and into the mouth. Even the mothers, preoccupied with tea and breakfast, inhaled the subtle, metallic sweetness of the morning air without realizing its danger. At the paintworks, the fumes rose like wisps of spectral snow, drifting out through open windows into streets lined with shuttered houses. Apprentices, pale and trembling, moved between vats and tables, stirring mixtures with cautious care, their breath catching faintly with each inhalation. The master walked among them, unaffected, noting the sheen of the pigments, the smoothness of the glazes, the gleam of freshly polished floors. He did not see the dust clinging to fingers, to sleeves, to hair. He did not notice the slow pallor creeping across the cheeks of those he oversaw. By noon, the industrial snow had settled into homes across the city. Windowsills, mantels, and floors bore a subtle, sparkling residue, gleaming faintly in the light. Families believed their houses clean, well-tended, and proper. The glow of white paint, the sheen of polished surfaces, the shimmer of ceramic and glass, these were the markers of pride, of civilization, of refinement. Yet beneath the surface, the invisible particles of lead worked tirelessly, embedding themselves in the blood, softening bones, corroding nerves. Children coughed quietly while playing. Mothers felt a subtle weakness creeping into their arms. Fathers noted headaches behind the eyes but attributed them to long hours or city smog. Even the apprentices, stepping carefully from factories and workshops, carried the snow home on their clothing, their hair, and their trembling hands. The poison traveled as easily as the frost, settling into nurseries, parlors, and kitchens where no one could perceive it. And still, the city glimmered. Gas lamps reflected faintly on damp streets. Sunlight pierced the fog in scattered beams, illuminating the industrial snow as though it were a marvel to behold. Pedestrians passed, oblivious to the invisible particles drifting through the air they inhaled. The factories, the carts, the mills, all continued their work, unceasing, producing beauty, commerce, and quiet death in equal measure. London was cloaked in industrial snow, and beneath its sparkling veil, the invisible toxin continued its merciless journey, settling into every home, every hearth, every lung, patient, silent, and utterly unobserved by those who believed themselves safe within the city's bright, industrious embrace. In a narrow, gaslit shop on a quiet London street, the chemist bent over his workbench with the intensity of a man possessed. Shelves lined with amber bottles, corked flasks, and boxes of powdered substances surrounded him, their labels neat and precise, the faint scent of alcohol and herbs filling the room. By day he sold remedies for every ache, tonic for every fatigue, powders to soothe every imagined malady. But in the stillness of his laboratory, he pursued a different curiosity, the slow accumulation of illness he had begun to observe in the city, subtle, persistent, and inexplicably linked to the very walls, pipes, and paints that adorned the homes of London's respectable citizens. It began with small patterns he noticed among his customers. Children, once rosy-cheeked and lively, arrived paler than their years should allow. Mothers complained of trembling hands, unexplained headaches, fatigue that rest could not ease. Servants coughed persistently, their skin ghostly beneath the soot of daily labor. The symptoms were scattered, random, yet faintly familiar to one who observed patterns with the patience of a chemist. He began to keep notes, cross-referencing houses, neighborhoods, and occupations, cataloguing each complaint as meticulously as he measured powders for his own remedies. One evening, while preparing a tincture in a copper beaker, he noticed a faint metallic taste clinging to the air, a sweetness that lingered after the herbs were crushed and the alcohol added. Curious, he dipped a gloved finger into the water he used to wash the glassware and tasted it carefully. The faint bitterness that followed, a whisper of metal, struck him with a sudden clarity. He remembered the pallor of the child who had visited his shop the previous week, the tremor in the mother's hands, the persistent cough of the housemaid who had come seeking relief. The pieces fell together, lead, present in the paints, the water, the domestic objects, invisible yet inescapable. He worked late into the night, poring over samples of pigments, flakes of paint, and water drawn from houses along the streets he knew well. Under the flicker of gaslight, he examined each specimen, measuring, testing, and recording with painstaking care. Tiny flecks of white, previously dismissed as dust, revealed themselves under the lens of his microscope as fine particles of lead. The sweetness in the water, the pallor of the skin, the tremors in the hands, they were all connected, all evidence of the same invisible menace. By the early hours, he had enough to form a theory. The homes, with their polished walls, their gleaming pipes, and their carefully arranged ornaments, were repositories of the very substance poisoning their occupants. Lead had crept silently into the daily lives of Londoners, inhaled with each breath, ingested with each sip of water or morsel of food, absorbed through skin touched by freshly painted surfaces. The city's brilliance, its glow and gleam, was the agent of its own quiet suffering. He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion and revelation mingling in his mind. The truth was clear. The beauty that Victorians so adored, the pristine walls, the polished floors, the gleaming pipes, was also the vehicle of poison. Lead had been hiding in plain sight, patient, persistent, and unrelenting. As dawn crept across the London skyline, casting pale light through the chemist's window, he felt both dread and purpose. He now held the key to understanding a menace that had silently shaped the health of the city for decades. The question remained, who would listen? Who would act before the invisible toxin claimed more victims? The chemist set down his pen and inhaled deeply, tasting the air, aware now of its subtle metallic trace. He had found the clue, and with that clue, the quiet, relentless battle against lead in Victorian homes had at last begun. The Chamber of Parliament, vast and solemn, carried the weight of centuries in its polished benches, towering arches, and endless rows of windows. On the morning the debate commenced, sunlight fell in thin, pale shafts, illuminating the murmuring assembly with a chill that seemed almost deliberate. Within those walls, the country's most respected men had gathered, their voices tempered by decorum, their intentions guided by the desire to preserve both reputation and authority. They were meant to deliberate matters of import, to safeguard the health and welfare of the populace. And yet, when the matter of lead in domestic life was raised, the chamber fell into a peculiar, uneasy quiet. A young member of Parliament had brought the evidence to light. A chemist's report, meticulously documented, described the insidious presence of lead in paints, pipes, glazes, and household dust. Pallor, tremors, fatigue, chronic illness symptoms traced back to the very walls and utensils of Victorian homes. The findings were precise, alarming, impossible to ignore. The young man's voice, steady but urgent, outlined the danger with clarity, citing laboratory results, case histories, and patterns observed across the city. Yet for each argument he presented, a subtle resistance emerged. Senior members shifted uneasily in their seats, glancing at one another as if acknowledging some uncomfortable truth that must not be stated too plainly. Whispers passed along rows of gentlemen, muffled and discreet, carrying the weight of doubt and self-interest. For while the evidence suggested urgent action, the economic and social implications were immense. Painters, plumbers, merchants, and manufacturers all relied upon lead in some form. Regulation, oversight, or prohibition would ripple through industry, disrupting the flow of commerce and unsettling the careful balance of society. Voices rose briefly, arguments about public health, morality, and civic duty, but each was tempered by restraint, hedged by concern for propriety, and softened by appeals to precedent and caution. The urgency of invisible poison, spreading silently through homes, seemed almost abstract compared to the concrete realities of taxes, wages, and urban management. The chamber, though filled with men of learning and influence, grew quieter as the minutes passed. The debate, once spirited, slowed to murmurs, punctuated by coughs, shifting feet, and the rustle of papers. Outside the chamber, London moved on. Horse-drawn carriages rattled over cobblestones. Factories exhaled their familiar clouds of smoke and metallic dust, and households remained unaware of the invisible danger seeping through walls, pipes, and furnishings. The pallor of children, the tremor of servants' hands, the fatigue of mothers and fathers, all continued unchecked, while the country's most powerful men debated quietly, delicately. Their words softened to the point of ineffectiveness. By late afternoon, the discussion had been postponed, adjourned to committees, to reports, to further study. The young MP, frustrated but undeterred, gathered his notes, aware that the poison continued its work unabated, invisible in the very rooms Parliament had vowed to protect. His voice, earnest and clear, had been heard, yet the chamber's polite hesitance had muted it. The invisible threat thrived in the interval, patient as ever, moving freely from factories to carts, from workshops to homes, settling on floors, walls, and furniture where the unsuspecting inhaled it with every breath. The Parliament debate had begun with urgency, but it had ended in quiet, a delicate acknowledgement without action. The chamber, with all its grandeur and authority, had inadvertently permitted the silent march of lead to continue, and London, with its polished homes, glowing walls, and industrious glow, remained unprotected from the subtle, merciless poison creeping into every household, every hearth, every breath. The chamber had spoken, yet the poison moved on. He arrived at the house early in the morning, the fog curling around his boots as though reluctant to release him from the streets. The inspector carried a black notebook, leather-bound and worn at the edges, filled with observations, measurements, and the faint hope that his diligence might make a difference. London was vast, sprawling, filled with chimneys that puffed smoke, streets slick with mud, and households both grand and humble. Yet beneath its familiar chaos, he sought something less visible, something that could not be seen without the careful scrutiny of a trained eye. The first house he entered was quiet, still, deceptively pristine. The walls gleamed in soft white, the floors polished, the furniture arranged with meticulous care. The family, polite and nervous, offered tea as he removed his hat, unaware of the weight of his purpose. He flipped open his notebook, making careful notes of room dimensions, the quality of paint, the age and material of pipes. He sniffed the air, noting the faint metallic tang that lingered near the hearth, brushing it aside at first as the residue of soot or damp. But as he moved through the rooms, examining ceilings, sills, and corners, the truth became undeniable. The dust was everywhere, fine, pale, insistent. It shimmered faintly in the early light, rising in delicate plumes whenever he shifted his weight or opened a shutter. He pressed a gloved hand to the floorboards, then to the windowsill, lifting particles that clung to leather and linen alike. The metallic scent grew stronger with each room, a subtle sweetness that was almost floral, almost enticing, and entirely dangerous. The inspector's pen moved quickly, recording the observations that the family would never understand. Fine particulate, observed on surfaces, appears consistent with lead contamination present in air, on walls, floors, and fixtures. The children, pale and quiet, peeked from the nursery doorway. One rubbed a trembling hand against the wall, leaving a faint streak. He knelt, inspecting the pattern, noting the flaking pigment, the soft powder that clung to the trim. He lifted a finger to his nose instinctively, tasting the faint metallic residue, a ghost of the poison that had been slowly accumulating for weeks, months, perhaps years. His stomach tightened at the realization. This was not merely neglect. It was invisible, insidious, and pervasive. The mother fussed over the youngest child, adjusting blankets and smoothing hair. She noticed the inspector's serious expression, but could not guess its cause. The maid, who had appeared earlier to offer tea, touched the polished table with fingers already dusted from daily labor. He observed her hands carefully, noting the tremor that betrayed fatigue or perhaps something more. Each household member, he realized, had already been touched by the invisible agent that occupied every corner. He moved to the kitchen, noting the pipes that carried water to the taps and kettles. Fine, pale streaks coated the interiors of basins and cisterns. The metallic taste he had observed in the paint dust lingered here as well, now mingled with the water that the family used to cook and drink. He scribbled furiously. Water, contamination likely, lead particles present, exposure, cumulative. By midday, the inspector had completed his survey. The notebook, already heavy with observations, now contained the weight of a city's hidden suffering. He packed his instruments, closed the leather cover, and stepped back into the fogged streets of London. The family, polite and anxious, remained unaware of the invisible menace that had been quietly catalogued in meticulous detail. Outside, the city breathed in and out, streets shrouded in mist, unaware that its walls, pipes, and powders were silent conspirators in a slow, unyielding conquest. The inspector walked on, black notebook tucked under his arm, carrying the truth that few were yet willing to confront. The houses gleamed, the children played, the mothers tended, and the invisible toxin continued its patient work, now noted, now understood, yet still dangerously free to claim every breath, every touch, every moment of unsuspecting life. It began quietly, in whispers shared behind lace curtains, over the polished surfaces of parlors, and across the tables of tea rooms. Mothers, exhausted and pale, had begun to notice patterns that no doctor, no master, no employer dared acknowledge. Their children, once robust and cheerful, had grown listless. Their hands trembled. Their cheeks bore a faint, unhealthy pallor. They cried softly at night, or slept fitfully, small bodies weighted by a force invisible yet persistent. The mothers saw the truth. It was the lead, the invisible toxin creeping from walls, pipes, and paints, poisoning the lives they nurtured so carefully. And they would not be silenced. In clusters, they gathered in whispered conversation. One mother described the tremor she had noticed in her eldest child, subtle but consistent. Another spoke of the metallic taste in the water she boiled for tea and porridge, faint at first, now undeniable. A third recounted the headaches that clung to her husband as he read the morning paper, the fatigue that overcame the maid, the pale streaks on the nursery floorboards that dusting could never remove. Each tale was corroborated by another, the pattern unmistakable. The homes they had labored to make safe were slowly poisoning those who lived within them. Yet resistance arose at every turn. Physicians dismissed their concerns as nerves or overwork. Employers called their observations fanciful or exaggerated. Even neighbors looked askance, unwilling to believe that the beauty they all admired, the polished floors, the gleaming paint, the bright walls, could conceal such danger. But the mothers persisted. They knew the symptoms, they traced the patterns, and they spoke of what they had witnessed with a precision born of necessity. Letters were written to local officials detailing symptoms, conditions, and household practices. Each letter was carefully folded and sealed, sent via post to authorities, who often set them aside, absorbed in matters of taxation, commerce, or city politics. In some cases, mothers approached chemists or apothecaries, asking for tests on water, paint, and dust. They brought samples of flaking walls, containers of water, and even hair from their children, desperate for validation. The chemists, initially skeptical, began to notice the consistency of complaints, the patterns that repeated from household to household, street to street. Within the homes, their persistence became a quiet revolution. Mothers stopped using water from questionable pipes to prepare meals, filtered it where possible, wiped surfaces with damp cloths repeatedly, ventilated rooms to the best of their ability. They monitored the children with an unblinking eye, documenting every cough, every tremor, every pallor. They taught their families to be vigilant, to question the taste of food and water, to observe the sheen on painted surfaces. In doing so, they quietly defied the complacency that had allowed the toxin to spread unchecked. The city outside continued in ignorance. Factory smoke drifted lazily through streets, carts rattled past, and the fog pressed over rooftops. Yet within these households, a subtle but determined force had arisen. The mothers, weary but resolute, became the first line of defense against a danger that otherwise remained unseen and unacknowledged. By evening, they gathered again, discussing observations, noting the hours of exposure, comparing results, and sharing strategies for mitigation. Each whisper strengthened the next, each observation fortified their resolve. They were no longer passive victims, they had become vigilant guardians, wielding knowledge as a shield against the invisible poison that threatened their children, their homes, and their lives. The mothers would not be silenced, and in their voices, the first tremors of resistance stirred against the quiet tyranny of lead in Victorian London. It was a small thing, easily overlooked, resting upon the counter of a chemist's shop, a thin pamphlet, its cover plain, its title printed in careful block letters. Yet within its pages lay a revelation that would ripple across the city, stirring fear, outrage, and the first glimmers of understanding. The pamphlet described the invisible threat that had long haunted Victorian homes, lead-in paints, pipes, and household dust, and its insidious effects on children, servants, and the families who believed themselves safe within the polished walls of their parlours and nurseries. The author, a chemist of quiet diligence, had compiled evidence painstakingly: samples of flaking paint, notes on discoloration in water, accounts from mothers whose children had grown pale, weak, and trembling. Each page was a careful argument, precise and unadorned, yet filled with urgency. He documented the symptoms observed in households across London, linking trembling hands, fatigue, headaches, and pallor to the pervasive presence of lead. He cited laboratory tests, chemical analyses, and meticulous observations, presenting a case that could not be dismissed as mere conjecture. The pamphlet began to circulate quietly at first. Mothers and servants found copies in chemists' shops, tucked between remedies and powders, or handed to them by sympathetic acquaintances. They read the pages with disbelief, then horror. The patterns they had noticed in their own homes were confirmed in print, validated in a way that gave their whispered fears tangible form. The tremors in their children's fingers, the weakness in their own arms, the headaches that no tonic could relieve, all were traced to the same invisible agent. Lead had crept silently through every aspect of domestic life, and now the truth could be held, examined, and shared. As word spread, the pamphlet became a quiet catalyst. Mothers carried it to neighbors, sharing observations aloud for the first time, their voices trembling not from fear alone but from the urgency of revelation. Housemaids whispered of pale dust clinging to freshly laundered linens. Fathers noted headaches and fatigue that matched descriptions in the printed pages. The city, which had long admired its gleaming walls, polished floors, and bright painted rooms, now confronted the reality that the very objects of pride were the instruments of harm. Printers' shops reported a sudden increase in demand, and pamphlets appeared on street corners, left in post offices, and distributed to schools and local societies. Clerks, labourers, and tradesmen read them in hushed tones, trading notes on symptoms and exposures. The industrial and domestic worlds alike began to recognize the presence of a threat that had long been ignored or dismissed. The pamphlet, small in size, wielded enormous influence. It illuminated the invisible, gave language to the unspoken, and lent authority to the concerns that had previously been ignored. By evening, households across London were quiet with examination. Fathers inspected pipes and faucets, mothers examined walls and furniture, servants noted traces of dust on clothing and hands. The air, once accepted as benign, was now suspected. The city's brilliance, its gleaming interiors, its carefully arranged decor, was no longer taken at face value. Something hidden, silent, and merciless had been revealed. The pamphlet had done what whispers alone could not. It stirred London awake. It transformed private anxiety into public awareness. And in the careful block letters and precise observations, the invisible toxin, long patient, long unchallenged, was finally seen for what it had been all along: a quiet, pervasive menace threading through the very fabric of Victorian life, demanding attention, action, and recognition. London would never view its homes the same way again. They arrived in the courtrooms of London, stern-faced and resolute, clutching ledgers and receipts, as if the weight of commerce alone could absolve them of the invisible menace that haunted their properties. Landlords, accustomed to obedience and discretion from their tenants, now found themselves accused of harboring danger within the walls they had long maintained with care, pride, and, in some cases, negligence. The law demanded scrutiny, citing the chemist's pamphlet, the complaints of mothers, and the observations of inspectors. Yet the landlords resisted, insisting that their homes were clean, their renovations proper, and their materials paint, pipes, plaster, both approved and customary. In the courtrooms, the debate unfolded with a peculiar tension. The landlord's attorneys spoke with the polish of experience, emphasizing tradition, precedent, and the impossibility of controlling microscopic particles in a bustling city. Lead has been used in paint for decades, one argued, voice calm but firm. It is durable, reliable, and essential for the construction and decoration of London homes. Any ailments observed are the result of mismanagement, negligence, or individual frailty, not the materials themselves. Their words were deliberate, measured, designed to persuade, distract, and delay. The mothers and servants who testified spoke softly, their voices carrying the weight of lived experience. They described trembling hands, pallid faces, children's fatigue, unexplained headaches, and the metallic taste that lingered in water and on surfaces. Their testimonies, vivid and unsettling, were bolstered by the chemist's samples and inspectors' meticulous records. Yet in response, the landlords leaned on authority, tradition, and the unspoken expectation that the lower classes' words should carry less weight than the ledger's balance or the reputation of the building. As the trial continued, the tension in the chamber thickened. Gas lamps flickered against polished wood and marble, casting shadows across faces, tense with anxiety or indignation. The landlord's arguments, though eloquent, carried an undertone of defiance. To admit fault was to admit liability. To acknowledge danger was to jeopardize both wealth and status. They refused to see what the mothers had observed, what the apprentices had felt, and what the inspector had recorded. Invisible to the eye, imperceptible to the uninformed, the poison continued its work within the very rooms that these men maintained with such pride. Outside the courthouse, the city moved on, oblivious to the trial unfolding within. Horses trotted along cobblestones slick with morning frost. Market vendors called their wares, and children played in alleyways dusted with powder that had escaped from mills, workshops, and homes alike. Yet within the courtrooms, the law and commerce collided. The landlords fought fiercely, their defenses rooted in habit, precedent, and profit. The mothers persisted, patient yet resolute, offering evidence of the invisible harm that had accumulated in every home their families occupied. By evening, the chambers quieted, the lawyers adjourned, and the judges retired to deliberate. The landlords returned to their estates, confident in the strength of tradition, unaware of the lingering danger that continued unabated in their walls. The mothers, meanwhile, spoke quietly among themselves, exchanging observations, bolstering each other's resolve, and preparing to continue the fight for recognition, reform, and safety. The law had begun to move, but the landlords fought to delay it, to resist it, to deny the truth. And London, still radiant in its polished homes, remained a city where beauty, commerce, and invisible menace coexisted, quiet, relentless, and unyielding. He had watched in silence for years, trained to observe symptoms, to prescribe remedies, to soothe ailments, without ever questioning the air, the walls, or the very structures within which his patients lived. But eventually, the evidence became impossible to ignore. The pallor of children, the tremor of hands, the faint but persistent metallic taste in water, the fatigue that no tonic could relieve, all pointed to a single, inescapable truth. Lead, long hidden in paint, pipes, and household dust, had infiltrated London homes, and the city's people were its unwitting victims. The doctor, weary of polite dismissal and hesitant authorities, finally chose to speak plainly. He began in small consultations, quietly, with the mothers who had first recognized the patterns. He listened carefully, recorded meticulously, and then explained, in the calm, deliberate tone of authority, the connection between the symptoms and the invisible toxin that had crept through their homes. "It is not nerves," he said to one mother, who had feared her child's illness was imaginary. "It is not fatigue alone. The cause lies in the very environment you inhabit. Lead has entered the walls, the water, the air you breathe." Word of his candid explanations spread quickly. Mothers brought their children to him in clusters, asking for confirmation, seeking relief, hoping for guidance. He tested water, scraped flakes of paint, measured the fine dust that had settled on furniture and floors. Each analysis confirmed what the mothers had suspected for so long. The very materials used to create beauty and refinement were now the agents of illness, their effects subtle, relentless, and cumulative. The doctor's reputation grew, though not without resistance. Some colleagues frowned upon his bluntness, warning that alarming the public might incite panic or damage commerce. Others dismissed him as overly imaginative, exaggerating minor effects for dramatic impact. Yet he persisted, presenting evidence clearly, referencing chemical analyses and demonstrating the correlation between exposure and symptoms. He spoke plainly in letters to city authorities, outlining the precise dangers of lead-based paints, contaminated pipes, and dusty surfaces, urging regulation and reform. In households, his words had immediate effect. Mothers began to implement measures to reduce exposure. Windows were opened for ventilation, floors scrubbed more frequently, and the youngest children kept away from walls and painted surfaces. Servants washed hands obsessively, boiling water before use and wiping down furniture repeatedly. Even the children, taught carefully, avoided contact with fresh paint or dusty surfaces. Slowly, awareness spread through the city, and the invisible toxin lost some of its omnipotence, though it remained patient and persistent. The doctor's plain speech reached the newspapers and local pamphlets. Articles, printed in small type, warned the public of the subtle dangers lurking in ordinary domestic life. The city, at first skeptical, began to stir with quiet concern. Questions were raised in committees, inspections ordered, and attention turned toward reforming building practices. The invisible menace, so long ignored, had finally been named. By night, after long hours of consultations and correspondence, the doctor leaned back in his chair, exhausted but resolute. Gaslight flickered across the walls, and he noticed for the first time how fine dust lingered in the air everywhere, inescapable yet no longer unrecognized. For the first time, the threat had a voice, a name, and an advocate. He had spoken plainly, and London, though slow to act, had begun to listen. the invisible toxin remained, patient and relentless, but its dominion was now contested, its quiet march interrupted by knowledge, vigilance, and the courage of one who refused to remain silent. It was a modest townhouse on a quiet street, unremarkable in appearance, yet destined to mark a subtle revolution. The walls had once been coated in gleaming white lead paint, as had every surface in the home. Sills, door frames, and even the wainscoting of the nursery. For years, the family had lived within its beauty, unaware of the poison that settled into every breath, every touch, every sip of water. The mother had watched her children grow pale, their hands trembling, their laughter subdued. The servants had complained of fatigue and subtle aches. And now, at last, the chemist's pamphlet, the inspector's meticulous notes, and the doctor's plain words had convinced them of the truth. The house would be repainted safely, deliberately, and with the knowledge that this small act might save lives. The first step was preparation. All furniture was moved from the rooms, draped in cloths to protect them from falling dust. The floors were swept, scrubbed, and rinsed repeatedly, until the pale residue that had accumulated over months of invisible decay was largely removed. Windows were opened, wide and deliberate, allowing the crisp morning air to chase out the lingering scent of lead and soot. Even the smallest crevices were inspected, brushed, and wiped with damp cloths, removing every trace of the old paint that might endanger those who lived there. Next came the selection of materials. The family, guided by the chemist and the doctor, chose a paint free from lead, carefully prepared with natural pigments and oils. It lacked the brilliance of the old paint, but it was safe, every brush stroke a promise that the invisible menace would no longer seep into walls, nor dust onto floors, nor drift through the air into the lungs of the household. The mother held the first brush with deliberate care, aware of the symbolic importance of her action. Each sweep of pigment across plaster was a reclamation, a gesture of defiance against the years of silent poisoning. The children, curious and cautious, watched from a distance. They were instructed not to touch the walls, not to breathe the air too closely, yet their excitement was palpable. For the first time in memory, their play was not accompanied by fatigue or tremor, and the mother felt a tentative relief in seeing their cheeks flush with life, unburdened by the invisible weight that had shadowed them for so long. The servants worked alongside her, wiping brushes, stirring paint, and feeling the satisfaction of labor that now had purpose beyond cleanliness, preservation of life. By the afternoon, the first rooms were fully coated. The white walls, once deadly, had been replaced with a muted, safe hue, reflecting light without poisoning those who inhabited them. The mother paused, stepping back to admire the result. It was not the brilliance that London prized, but it was a brilliance of another kind, the brilliance of safety, of knowledge applied, of vigilance rewarded. Even the father, previously skeptical of precaution, nodded in quiet approval, acknowledging the wisdom of his family's insistence. The household had become a model, a proof that the danger, though patient and pervasive, could be mitigated through care, observation, and action. Outside, the city continued in its fog, unaware of the small victory within one townhouse, yet the ripple of awareness had begun. At night, as the family gathered in the now safe parlor, they inhaled freely for the first time in months. The old dust had been replaced, the poison displaced, and the household, though scarred by months of invisible harm, breathed with hope. The first house had been repainted in safety. The walls no longer gleamed with deception. The air no longer carried quiet menace. And for the first time, the city's invisible toxin had been confronted, challenged, and partially contained, one brushstroke at a time. The law, slow and deliberate, finally reached the point where action could no longer be delayed. Years of observation, of whispered complaints, of chemists' notes and inspectors' meticulous records had culminated in a proposal that would forbid the use of lead in household paints and domestic materials. Yet even as Parliament debated the measure, it became painfully clear that the ban, though necessary, had arrived too late. The poison had already settled deep into the bones, lungs, and blood of countless Londoners, and the damage could not be undone by legislation alone. The news spread cautiously through the city. Notices were posted, circulating among chemists' shops, public halls, and select households. Editors wrote editorials in small type, praising the measure while acknowledging the grim reality. Countless families had already endured years of exposure. Mothers read the words with a mixture of relief and lingering fear, knowing that future children would be spared what theirs had suffered, yet still mourning the subtle, invisible toll that the toxin had exacted. Fathers shook their heads, considering the decades of health compromised in homes once thought secure. Servants, apprentices, and labourers whispered among themselves, aware that their trembling hands and pallid faces were the silent legacy of an invisible enemy that had long been permitted to operate unchecked. In Parliament, the debate had been heated. Advocates for the ban cited chemical analyses, detailed accounts of illnesses, and the testimonies of mothers who had refused to remain silent. Opponents, often representing industry and commerce, argued against regulation, claiming that the restrictions would harm trade, delay construction, and disrupt domestic progress. Yet the evidence proved insurmountable. The chemists, inspectors, and physicians who had spoken plainly in previous years had finally forced acknowledgement. The law passed, but it could not erase the years in which the poison had spread quietly through homes, nurseries, and parlours. In households, the effects of lead continued to manifest. Children who had grown pale and weak, servants whose hands trembled, mothers burdened by fatigue, these symptoms were now recognized as traces of past exposure. Repainting, replacing pipes, and scrubbing surfaces could remove the residual presence of the toxin, yet it could not restore what had already been claimed. The city's glory, its polished floors, its gleaming walls, its carefully arranged furnishings, remained tainted by memory, a reminder that beauty had once concealed danger. Even as the ban took effect, manufacturers scrambled to adapt. Alternative pigments were sought, new materials tested, and the production of lead-free paint slowly increased. Workshops altered their methods, emphasizing ventilation, cleanliness, and safety. The factories that had once exhaled clouds of dust into the streets now employed measures to reduce exposure, though the air in the city remained faintly tinged with the remnants of past labor. The poison had lingered too long to vanish entirely, and generations would bear the mark of the negligence that had permitted it to spread. For the families who had suffered, the ban brought little consolation for those already harmed. Mothers continued to care for children weakened by years of invisible exposure, doctors treated symptoms that could not be reversed, and households remained vigilant against lingering traces of dust and flakes. The city itself, proud and industrious, had learned a painful lesson. Legislation could prevent further harm, but it could not undo what had been done. The ban had come, but it had come too late. The invisible toxin remained a shadow in the memories of London, a silent testament to the dangers that had long been overlooked, and to the persistence of a menace that no beauty, no polish, no gleam could entirely conceal. Even years after the ban, London remained haunted. The streets, once filled with the clatter of carts and the hiss of gas lamps, carried a subtler echo, the memory of dust, pale and metallic, drifting unseen into homes and lungs alike. Though lead had been removed from paint, pipes, and household materials, the remnants of its presence lingered in corners, behind baseboards, and within the fibres of textiles that had absorbed it long ago. Londoners, proud of their sparkling parlours, gleaming floors, and polished furniture, remained unknowingly connected to a past that continued to assert itself in subtle, unrelenting ways. Children born after the ban played in rooms scrubbed carefully of flaking paint, breathing filtered air. Yet their parents carried scars of exposure. Mothers remembered the pallor of their children, the tremor of small hands, the headaches that had plagued their evenings. Fathers recalled the exhaustion that could not be explained by labor alone. Servants, whose hands had trembled for years, bore the physical memory of contamination, joint pains, faint tremors, and lingering fatigue that whispered of the invisible poison that had claimed dominion over their working hours. Even the houses themselves retained traces of history. Floors bore microscopic fragments embedded deep into the grain. Walls harbored invisible remnants beneath layers of safer paint, and dust still clung stubbornly to ledges and mantelpieces. The very air seemed tinged with the ghost of the toxin, not enough to harm, but enough to remind the vigilant observer of the years of quiet conquest. The city's brilliance, its polished facades, its whitewashed streets, its proud architecture now carried the memory of an era when beauty had masked danger. Some families attempted to expunge the past entirely. Walls were scraped and repainted, pipes replaced, floors scrubbed and polished repeatedly. Yet in doing so, they discovered the persistence of what had been. Lead could be hidden, its danger mitigated, but it could not be undone entirely. The memory of its presence lived in the tremors, the pale skin, the subtle fatigue that lingered despite the passage of time. London had learned that even invisible threats leave traces, and that the city's own pride had once rendered it blind. The mothers who had refused to remain silent now shared their stories, whispering them to daughters and neighbors alike. They spoke of the chemical sweetness in the air, the shimmer of dust in sunlight, the tremors in hands and limbs that had once seemed inexplicable. They chronicled the perseverance required to maintain vigilance, to protect children and household staff from a hazard that had been nearly universal, yet unseen. Their testimony became a quiet legacy, a moral and practical guide for those who would follow. Even the chemists and physicians, long retired or passed on, left traces of knowledge in journals, pamphlets, and letters. Their work had illuminated the invisible menace, forced action in Parliament, and ultimately compelled the ban. Yet, their discoveries also reminded the city that prevention, however essential, cannot erase the past. Lead had already claimed its mark, and London remained haunted by dust as surely as it had once been poisoned by it. In the quiet hours of morning, when sunlight filtered through lace curtains and touched polished floors, the faint shimmer of dust still danced in its rays. It was no longer deadly, but it was a reminder, a ghost of a time when beauty concealed menace and when the invisible toxin reigned silently through every home. London, radiant and industrious, could no longer claim innocence. The city had survived, but it remained haunted, and the dust, silent, patient, unyielding, continued to whisper of the era when the invisible toxin ruled the domestic heart of Victorian life.